The sixth woman stepped off the stagecoach into Dry Hollow's dust, and every soul watching knew she'd be dead or gone within a month. 5 before her had tried. 5 had failed. The ranch waiting at the edge of town wasn't just brutal, it was cursed, they said, run by a man with ice in his veins and blood too mixed to be trusted. But Ruth Calder wasn't like the others. She didn't carry hope in her trunk. She carried rage and a hunger for something worth more than safety. What she didn't know was that Kyle Rourke was waiting, and he didn't plan to make it easy. If you want to see how far this story of survival and fire can go, stay until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far Ruth's legacy reaches. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Ruth Calder felt the jolt in her bones. Dust billowed through the gaps in the wooden frame, settling on her dark traveling dress like a second skin. Through the window, she could see Dry Hollow, a collection of weathered buildings squatting beneath a merciless sun, their paint long since surrendered to wind and time. This was the end of the line. Literally. The driver's voice cut through the stillness. "Dry Hollow, ma'am. All out." Ruth gathered her skirts and stepped down onto ground that felt as unforgiving as stone. The heat hit her immediately, a wall of it that made her eastern clothes feel like a prison. She stood there for a moment, one gloved hand still gripping the coach door, and surveyed what would be her new home. Or her new mistake. The town wasn't much to look at. A general store with a crooked sign. A saloon with batwing doors that hung slightly askew. A church whose white paint had gone gray with neglect. And everywhere, the dust. In the air, on the buildings, in the very souls of the people who stopped what they were doing to stare at her. "Your trunk, ma'am." The driver had already hauled it down, eager to be gone. He wouldn't meet her eyes. None of them would. Ruth knew what they were thinking. She'd heard the whispers at every stop along the way, growing louder the closer she got to Dry Hollow. 5 women before you. 5 failures. You'll be the 6th. "Thank you." She pressed a coin into his palm, more than the fare required. His surprise was almost worth it. The stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, and Ruth was alone. She stood in the center of the street, her trunk at her feet, and waited. The advertisement had been clear. Transportation to the ranch will be provided upon arrival. What it hadn't mentioned was how long she'd have to stand here, being watched like a curiosity in a circus. An older woman emerged from the general store, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was weathered, carved by years of frontier life into something both hard and sad. "You're the new one, then?" It wasn't a question. Ruth called her. She didn't extend her hand. Something in the woman's posture told her it wouldn't be accepted. "Martha Yates. I run the store." Martha's eyes traveled over Ruth, taking in every detail. The quality of her dress despite its somber color, the straightness of her spine, the absence of fear in her face. "You know what you're walking into?" A job. A grave, more likely. Martha's bluntness was almost refreshing. 5 women in 2 years. The first one lasted 3 weeks. The second, 10 days. The others, she shook her head. "Well, the pattern's clear enough." Ruth met her gaze steadily. "What happened to them?" "Ran." Martha said it like a verdict. Every last one. Couldn't take it. The isolation, the work, the man himself. Some left in the dead of night. Others made it to town first, begging for passage back east. One made it as far as the church before she broke down crying. But they survived. Martha's expression shifted, something like respect flickering in her eyes. "You're asking the right questions, at least." "Yes, they survived. Cale Rourke might be hard as iron and twice as cold, but he's never laid a hand on any of them. Didn't have to. The ranch does his breaking for him." "Then I suppose I should be grateful he's not also a brute." A harsh laugh escaped Martha. "You've got spine, I'll give you that, but spine won't keep you warm when winter comes and you're 10 miles from another living soul. Won't help when the work breaks your back and the silence drives you mad." Ruth looked past her toward the edge of town where the land rose in dusty hills. "I didn't come here looking for easy, Mrs. Yates." "No?" Martha's voice softened just a fraction. "Then what did you come looking for?" Before Ruth could answer, a sound cut through the afternoon heat, hoofbeats, steady and purposeful. Every head in the street turned toward the approaching rider. He came from the west, materializing out of the shimmer of heat like something conjured rather than born. The horse was a powerful gray, moving with the kind of confidence that came from perfect understanding between rider and mount. And the man, Ruth's first thought was that he looked like he'd been carved from the same unforgiving stone as the land itself. Kyle Rourke sat the saddle with unconscious ease, his body moving with the horse's rhythm as if they were a single creature. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could see enough: the strong jaw, the sharp cheekbones, skin bronzed by sun and marked by heritage that this town would never fully accept. His clothes were worn but well-made, practical, free of ornamentation. He brought the horse to a stop 10 feet from where Ruth stood, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of leather as the horse shifted its weight. Then he dismounted in one fluid motion, and finally, she could see his face clearly. His eyes were the color of winter sky, a pale, startling gray that seemed to see through pretense and polish straight to the bone. There were lines at the corners carved by squinting into sun and wind. His mouth was set in a line that suggested smiling was a language he'd forgotten, if he'd ever known it at all. "Miss Calder." His voice was low, roughened by disuse or preference. "I'm Cale Rourke." "Mr. Rourke." She didn't curtsy, didn't lower her eyes. "I'm ready to go." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of it. "You haven't asked about the terms. I read the advertisement. Room and board plus wages of $15 a month. Work to include cooking, cleaning, mending, and such other tasks as required." She paused. "The compensation is fair for the frontier. The isolation is mentioned, and the previous—" She chose her words carefully. "Departures are a matter of public record. And you came anyway." "I came because of them, Mr. Rourke, not in spite of them." Ruth met his gaze without flinching. "Those women left because they expected something other than what they found. I have no such illusions." Cale's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think you know what you're walking into." "I think I know myself, which is more relevant." For the first time, something that might have been the distant cousin of amusement touched his features. It was gone so quickly, Ruth might have imagined it. "Can you ride?" "No." Another flicker of what? Interest? Respect? It was impossible to read him. "Most lie about that. Say yes, then fall off within 10 minutes and blame the horse." "I see no point in lying about an easily verified fact." "You'll learn then. Can't get around the ranch on foot." He turned to his horse, adjusting the saddle. "For now, you'll ride with me." Ruth's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice level. "That seems improper." "Propriety died about 50 miles back, Miss Calder. Out here, we deal in practicality." He gathered the reins and swung back into the saddle with that same effortless grace. "Your trunk will follow with the supply wagon tomorrow. Bring what you need for tonight." She had a small carpet bag with essentials. Martha Yates, still watching from the porch of her store, called out, "You change your mind, girl. You come straight back to town. I'll find you a place." Ruth nodded her thanks, then turned back to Kael. He'd moved the horse closer and now extended his hand down to her. She looked at it, weathered, scarred across the knuckles, strong, and then up at his face. This was the moment, the first test. She took his hand. His grip was firm, impersonal, as he pulled her up behind the saddle with more strength than effort. "Hold on to the saddle rim. Don't grab at me unless you're falling." "Understood." He clicked his tongue and the horse moved forward, and Dry Hollow began to fall away behind them. The ride was silent for the first mile. Ruth focused on keeping her seat, on the rhythm of the horse's movement, on not thinking about how close she was to a man she'd met mere minutes ago. The land stretched out in all directions, rolling hills covered in dry grass, scattered stands of cottonwood marking where water ran, and everywhere the endless sky, so big it made her feel like an insect. "You from back east?" It wasn't a question. Kael's voice carried back to her over the sound of hoofbeats. "Boston. Long way to come for work." "Perhaps I was looking for a long way to come." He was quiet for a moment, processing that. "Running from something." "Aren't we all, Mr. Rourke?" His shoulders tensed slightly, the only indication he'd heard her. "The ranch isn't a hiding place, Miss Calder. It's a working operation. I need someone who can handle the labor, not someone looking to disappear." Those aren't mutually exclusive conditions. No, he admitted. I suppose they're not. Another mile passed. The sun was starting its slow descent toward the western horizon, turning the sky amber and gold. The temperature would drop soon. Ruth had learned that much about the frontier. Days that scorched, nights that froze. Why did the others leave? She asked it quietly, not sure he'd answer. Cale was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't. Then, different reasons. The first one expected romance, thought she'd answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, not a housekeeper. Couldn't handle the truth. And the second? Afraid of the isolation, started hearing things in the night, coyotes, wind, her own thoughts, left before she lost her mind completely. The third? Couldn't do the work. Came from means, probably. Soft hands, soft life. Lasted 2 weeks before her back gave out. Ruth absorbed this. And the fourth and fifth? His voice went even flatter. The fourth left because of me. Said I was savage, uncivilized. That my blood made her uncomfortable. He said it without emotion, but Ruth heard the old wound beneath the words. The fifth left because the town convinced her I was dangerous. That the curse was real and she'd die if she stayed. What curse? Pick one. They've invented dozens. Some say I killed my wife, though I've never been married. Others say the land itself is cursed, that nothing good can grow here. The most popular version involves my mother's people, some nonsense about spirits and blood debts. He turned his head slightly, and she caught his profile against the sky. Which story do you believe, Miss Calder? None of them. Why not? Because curses are just stories people tell to explain their own failures. The women who left, they left because they couldn't adapt, or because they were lied to about what they'd find, or because they let fear make their decisions for them. Ruth paused. Not because of spirits or blood or any kind of mystical punishment. Cale turned more fully this time, looking at her over his shoulder. His pale eyes searched her face, looking for something. You're either very brave or very foolish. Or very desperate, Ruth said quietly. But desperation can be its own kind of strength, Mr. Rourke. He studied her a moment longer, then turned back to the trail. But something had shifted between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps. A mutual recognition of kindred damage. The sun was touching the horizon when the ranch finally came into view. It sat in a shallow valley, sheltered on 3 sides by rising hills. The main house was larger than Ruth had expected. 2 stories, built of timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. It had been built to last. She could see that immediately. No frills or ornament, but solid construction that spoke of someone who understood this land. Behind the house stretched a series of outbuildings. A barn, a stable, storage sheds, and what looked like a bunkhouse, though it appeared empty. Fences radiated out from the central buildings, marking off pastures and corrals. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing, small dark shapes against the golden grass. It was isolated, yes. Harsh, certainly. But there was something almost beautiful about it, too. A kind of stark honesty that Ruth found herself responding to. The house is sturdy, Cale said as they approached. Roof doesn't leak. Windows all have glass. Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. Well is behind the house. Water's clean and cold. Outhouse is between the house and barn. He pulled the horse to a stop near the porch. Kitchen's stocked, but supplies come in on the 1st of each month. You'll need to plan accordingly. He dismounted first, then turned to help her down. Ruth slid from the horse, grateful to be back on solid ground even if her legs felt shaky. There are chickens for eggs, and I keep a milk cow. Cale was already moving, leading the horse toward the barn. You'll be responsible for both, plus the garden plot, though there's not much growing this time of year. Breakfast at dawn, dinner when the work's done. I'm not particular about food, but I expect it regular. Ruth followed him, taking in every detail. The yard was clean, well-maintained. The buildings showed care despite their weathering. This wasn't the home of a savage or a madman. This was the work of someone who took pride in what they'd built. Questions? Cale glanced back at her. About 100, but Ruth chose the most practical one. What happened to the workers? The bunkhouse looks empty. Had a few hands, but they moved on. Winter's coming, and there's not enough work to justify keeping them through the cold months. Come spring, I'll hire new ones for calving season. So it's just the 2 of us. That a problem? Just establishing facts, Mr. Rourke. He stopped in the barn doorway, turning to face her fully. In the fading light, his features were all shadow and angle. Let me establish some facts for you, Miss Calder. This ranch is my life's work. Everything I have is in this land, these buildings, that herd. I need someone who can handle the domestic work so I can focus on keeping this operation alive. I'm not looking for companionship, romance, or anything beyond competent labor. If you can provide that, we'll get along fine. If you can't, there's no shame in leaving. The others proved that much. Ruth held his gaze. I didn't travel 1,000 miles to run at the first hardship, Mr. Rourke. You'll have your competent labor. What you do with it is your business. Something crossed his face. Approval, maybe? Or at least a grudging acceptance. Fair enough. Go on up to the house. I'll be in after I tend to the horse. Ruth walked back across the yard as dusk settled over the ranch. The air was already cooling, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, she could hear Kyle moving in the barn, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horse. The house was unlocked. Of course it was. Who would rob a place this isolated? She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The main room was larger than expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Simple furniture, a table, chairs, a worn settee. Clean, she noted with some relief. Sparse, but not neglected. A doorway led to what must be the kitchen, and a staircase rose along the right wall to the second floor. Ruth climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth wooden banister. The second door on the right, he'd said. She pushed it open. The room was small but adequate. A bed with a simple frame, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a chest of drawers, a chair by the window. The window itself looked out over the front yard and beyond to the hills, now going purple in the twilight. She set down her carpet bag and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin but clean, the blankets worn but sufficient. This was her space now, her room in her new life. Ruth closed her eyes and let herself feel, just for a moment, the weight of what she'd done. The bridges burned, the distance traveled, the enormous risk she'd taken on nothing but determination and the belief that anything, even this, had to be better than what she'd left behind. A sound from downstairs brought her back to herself. Kyle had come in. She could hear his boots on the floorboards, the creak of the kitchen door. Time to begin. Ruth stood, smoothed her dress, and went down to meet her new life head-on. She found him in the kitchen, setting a fire in the stove. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, despite what she guessed was an age somewhere in his mid-30s. He glanced up as she entered. Stove's temperamental, needs kindling laid just so, or it'll smoke you out. He demonstrated, his movements economical and sure. Fire'll be ready in a few minutes. What would you like for dinner? He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. There's salt pork in the larder, beans, some potatoes. Nothing fancy. I wasn't expecting fancy, Mr. Rourke. Kyle, he said it abruptly. Out here, formality's a waste of breath. You can call me Kale. Then you should call me Ruth. He nodded once, then moved past her toward the door. I've got evening chores. Feed the animals, check the fences nearest the house. I'll be back in an hour. And then he was gone, leaving Ruth alone in the kitchen of a strange house, 1,000 miles from everything she'd known, about to cook dinner for a man who was little more than a stranger, but would be her only human contact for the foreseeable future. She took a breath, then another, then rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The larder was well organized. She'd give him that. Everything labeled, nothing wasted. She found the salt pork, the beans, already soaked, she noted, potatoes, onions. Basic ingredients, but she could work with basic. As her hands moved through the familiar motions of preparing food, Ruth felt something inside her begin to settle. This, at least, was known territory. Cooking, she understood. The chemistry of heat and time, the transformation of raw ingredients into sustenance. It was concrete, measurable, controllable. Unlike everything else in her life right now, the stove began to heat, and she adjusted the damper the way Kyle had shown her. Set the pot of beans on to simmer. Sliced the pork, diced the potatoes and onions. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking food, and despite everything, the uncertainty, the isolation, the strangeness, Ruth felt a small spark of something that might have been hope. She could do this. She could learn this land, master this work, prove everyone wrong. She had to. Kyle returned exactly when he said he would, his boots loud on the porch. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, pausing to take in the scene. The table set for two, the food ready, Ruth standing by the stove with a competence that clearly surprised him. "It's ready," she said simply. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ruth was grateful for it, actually, a chance to observe without the pressure of conversation. She watched how he ate, methodically, appreciatively, but without comment. Watched how he moved through the space of his own home with the kind of unconscious ease that came from long habit. When they finished, she stood to clear the plates. "I'll wash up. Water needs heating, kettle's by the pump." Ruth nodded and set to work. Behind her, she heard Kyle rise from the table, the scrape of the chair, his footsteps moving toward the front room. By the time she finished cleaning the kitchen, full darkness had fallen. Through the window, she could see nothing but blackness and the faint glitter of more stars than she'd ever imagined existed. The isolation hit her then, truly hit her. The enormous distance between herself and any other human being besides the silent man in the next room. She found him sitting by the fireplace, which he'd lit against the growing cold. He had a ledger open on his lap, a pencil in his hand, but he wasn't writing, just staring into the flames. "Mr. Rourke, Kyle." She corrected herself. "What time should I have breakfast ready?" "Dawn. Around 5:30 this time of year." "I'll need to know where everything is. The chicken coop, the garden, the cow." "I'll show you tomorrow, after breakfast." He closed the ledger. "You should get some rest. Days start early here." It was a dismissal, gentle but firm. Ruth nodded. "Good night, then." "Ruth." He stopped her as she reached the stairs. She turned back. He was looking at her with that same searching expression from earlier, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why did you really come here? And don't give me that line about needing work. A woman with your speech, your bearing, you had options." She could lie. Should lie, probably. But something in his directness demanded the same in return. "Because I needed to be somewhere no one knew me. Somewhere I could be only what I proved myself to be, not what I was born to or what mistakes had defined me." Ruth met his eyes. "You're not the only one running from whispers, KL. The difference is, I chose to run towards something instead of just away." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "Fair enough. But out here, proving yourself isn't done with words. It's done with sweat and blood, and not breaking when everything in you wants to." "I understand. Do you?" He stood, moving closer. Not threatening, but intense. "The women who left, they weren't weak. They were sensible. This life, this land, it strips away everything soft and sees what's underneath. Most people don't like what they find." "Then I suppose we'll see what I'm made of." Ruth kept her voice steady. "Good night, Kyle." She climbed the stairs before he could respond, before her courage could fail, before the enormity of what she'd committed to could overwhelm her. In her room, Ruth changed into her nightgown with shaking hands. The temperature had dropped sharply, and she hurried under the blankets, curling into herself for warmth. Through the floor, she could hear Kyle moving around downstairs. The creak of floorboards, the sound of the fire being banked, his boots on the stairs. His room must be nearby. She heard a door open and close, the groan of bed springs. Then silence. The kind of silence Ruth had never experienced in her life. Not the quiet of a sleeping city, punctuated by distant sounds of life. This was absolute, profound. The silence of true isolation. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and Ruth pulled the blankets tighter. This was her life now. This room, this house, this impossible man and his failing ranch at the edge of nowhere. She'd chosen it, walked into it with eyes open, and now there was no going back. The second woman had started hearing things, Kyle had said. Ruth closed her eyes and listened to the silence, willing herself not to be afraid. But in the darkness, with 1,000 miles between her and everything she'd known, fear came anyway. Not of Kyle, or the curse, or even the work. Fear that she'd run so far only to discover she couldn't outrun herself. That whatever was broken in her would stay broken, no matter how much distance she put between herself and Boston. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the house, and Ruth's eyes flew open. Just the wood settling, she told herself. Old houses made noise. It meant nothing. Another sound, or was it the wind? Ruth forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly. This was the test the second woman had failed. The isolation, the darkness, her own thoughts. She would not fail it, would not let fear make her decisions. She thought of Kyle downstairs on her first night and his assessment of the previous women. None of them had been weak, he'd said. They'd been sensible. Ruth had never been particularly sensible. It was probably the only thing that had gotten her this far. She closed her eyes again and started counting her breaths. 1, 2, 3, in and out. A meditation technique she'd learned long ago in a life that seemed like someone else's now. Somewhere around 200, she finally fell asleep. She dreamed of running, but whether she was running toward something or away, she couldn't tell. Dawn came cold and pale through her window. Ruth woke to a sky the color of steel and a chill that had seeped into her very bones. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The ranch, Kyle, her new life. She dressed quickly in the freezing air, her fingers clumsy with cold. When she made it downstairs, she found Kyle already in the kitchen, the stove lit, coffee brewing. "You're late," he said without looking at her. "Sun's been up 10 minutes. Ruth checked the window. The barest hint of light touched the eastern horizon. "I'll do better tomorrow." "See that you do." He poured himself coffee in a battered tin cup. "Help yourself, then come outside. I'll show you the routine." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and Ruth was grateful for it. She gulped down half a cup, then followed Kyle out into the bitter morning. The next hour was a blur of information. The chicken coop. Here's how you collect eggs without getting pecked. The cow. Bessie, gentle but stubborn, needs milking twice a day. The garden plot, mostly fallow now, but these few hardy vegetables need tending. The well, the rope phrase. He needs to replace it. Be careful until he does. Ruth's head spun with details, but she committed each one to memory. This was survival. This was proving herself. "Breakfast after morning chores," Kyle said as they walked back toward the house, both carrying buckets, Ruth's full of eggs, his of fresh milk. "Then I'll be riding out to check the herd. You'll have the house to yourself for most of the day." "What needs doing?" "There's mending in the basket by the fireplace. Some of the window frames need fresh putty before winter. The putty's in the shed, and the spare room upstairs could use cleaning if you're ambitious." It was a test, Ruth realized. See how much she could accomplish without supervision. See if she'd slack off when he wasn't watching. She spent the morning working like a woman possessed. Made breakfast, more salt pork, eggs, biscuits from scratch. Cleaned the kitchen until it gleamed, tackled the mending with methodical precision, even though her fingers were more accustomed to needlepoint than patching work clothes. Started on the window frames, learning as she went how to apply the putty, smooth it, make it seal properly. By noon, her back ached and her hands were cramping, but she'd made visible progress. The house looked better, felt better. She'd left her mark on it. Ruth made herself lunch from the leftovers, then went upstairs to tackle the spare room. It was full of odds and ends, pieces of furniture, crates of who knew what, a thick layer of dust over everything. She opened the window to let in fresh air and got to work. That's where Kyle found her 3 hours later, covered in dust, dragging a heavy trunk toward the door. "What are you doing?" Ruth jumped, startled. She hadn't heard him come in. "Clearing the room. You said it needed cleaning." He moved past her, grasped the trunk easily, and lifted it with the kind of strength that made it look effortless. "I meant sweep the floor, wipe down the surfaces, not reorganize everything." It seemed inefficient to clean around the clutter. Kale set the trunk down in the hallway, then turned to look at the room. Ruth had sorted everything, furniture stacked neatly on one side, crates organized by contents on the other, the floor cleared and partially swept. "You've been working all day." It wasn't quite an accusation, but close. "Yes." "Did you eat lunch?" Ruth hesitated. "Yes." "Don't lie to me." His voice was sharp. "I can count plates, Ruth. You made yourself coffee and ate standing up, probably not much. Then came straight up here. I wanted to make progress. I wanted you to pace yourself." He cut her off. "This isn't Boston, where you can push through on determination and then recover tomorrow. Out here, if you break yourself, there's no help coming. You're no good to me, injured or exhausted." It was the first time he'd shown anything like concern, and it caught Ruth off guard. "I'm fine." "You're trembling." She looked down at her hands. He was right. A fine tremor ran through her fingers, fatigue and hunger and the cold all combining. Cale swore under his breath. Come on, you need food and rest. I'm not finished. It'll keep. His tone left no room for argument. Downstairs. Now. Ruth wanted to protest, to prove she was stronger than this, but her body betrayed her. A wave of dizziness made her sway, and Kyle's hand shot out to steady her. Stubborn doesn't mean strong, he said quietly. That's a lesson you need to learn quick. He guided her downstairs, his hand firm on her elbow. Sat her at the kitchen table like she was something fragile, which rankled. But when he set food in front of her, bread, cheese, leftover pork, her body overrode her pride and she ate. Kyle watched her from across the table, his expression unreadable. When she finally slowed down, he spoke. The others pushed too hard at first, too, tried to prove themselves. But this land doesn't care about your pride, Ruth. It only cares if you can last. I can last. Maybe. He stood, clearing the plates. But not if you kill yourself in the first week trying to impress me. I'm not trying to impress you. No? He turned to look at her. Then what are you trying to do? Ruth met his eyes. Survive. On my own terms. Something in his expression softened, just fractionally. Then you need to be smart about it. Work hard, yes, but work sustainable. Can you do that? She nodded, too tired to argue anymore. Good. Cale moved to the door. I've got evening chores. You rest. I'll handle dinner tonight. That's not a negotiation. He was already gone. Ruth sat at the table as the afternoon light faded, feeling the exhaustion in every muscle, every bone. Her pride stung. She hated being weak, hated needing help, hated that he'd been right about her pushing too hard. But underneath the sting was something else, something that felt almost like relief. For the first time in years, someone had noticed she was struggling and actually done something about it. Not lectured her, not judged her, but just helped. It was such a foreign concept that Ruth didn't know what to do with it. When Kyle returned an hour later with firewood and the makings of dinner, she was still sitting there, lost in thought. You fall asleep? He dropped the wood by the fireplace with a clatter. No, just thinking. Dangerous habit. But there was the ghost of humor in his voice. They worked together to prepare dinner, moving around each other in the small kitchen with a tentative choreography. Cale was surprisingly competent with food. Nothing fancy, but he knew his way around a pan and a pot. You cook often? Ruth asked as he stirred something on the stove. Had to learn when the last woman left. Couldn't afford to hire another one right away, so I taught myself the basics. He shrugged. It's just chemistry. Heat plus ingredients plus time equals edible. That's a remarkably practical way to look at it. Is there another way? Ruth thought of the elaborate meals she'd been taught to oversee in her old life, the social performance of dinner parties and formal dining. For some people, cooking is art, expression. For me, it's fuel. Cale tasted what he was making, added salt. Nothing wrong with art, I suppose, but I need fuel. They ate together again, the silence more comfortable this time. Ruth's exhaustion made her almost lightheaded, but the food helped ground her. Tomorrow, Kyle said as they finished, I'll show you the proper boundaries of the property. The places you can go safely. The places to avoid. Avoid? Rattlesnakes in some of the rock piles. Unstable ground near the creek when it's running high. And there's a box canyon to the northwest that looks inviting, but has only one way in and out. Easy to get trapped if you're not paying attention. Ruth absorbed this. Another layer of complexity to this land, another set of rules to learn. I'll also teach you to shoot. She looked up sharply. Is that necessary? Out here? Yes. Cale's expression was serious. Coyotes go after the chickens. Sometimes we get wolves. And if you're out on the property alone and get cornered by something, predator or otherwise, you need to be able to defend yourself. The weight of it settled on Ruth like a physical thing. This wasn't a life where she could rely on others for protection. This was a life where survival meant competence in everything, including violence. All right, she said quietly. Teach me. Kyle nodded, something like approval in his eyes. We'll start this week, once you've got your strength back. That night, Ruth fell into bed so exhausted she barely remembered undressing. But before sleep claimed her, she lay in the darkness and listened to the house settle around her, to Kyle moving through his own nighttime routine somewhere down the hall. One day down. One day survived. The question was, how many more could she last? In the darkness, Ruth smiled grimly to herself. As many as it took. That was the only answer that mattered. The first week became a rhythm of survival and small victories. Ruth learned to wake before dawn without needing the light to tell her, her body adjusting to the demands of ranch life with a stubbornness that matched her will. She learned the precise angle to hold the milk bucket so Bessie wouldn't kick it over, learned which hens were docile and which would draw blood given half a chance, learned to read the sky for weather and the wind for warnings. Kyle kept his distance, watching but not hovering. He'd set a task and leave her to it, only stepping in when she was about to make a mistake that would cost time or resources. His teaching method was spare, economical, show once, correct once, then expect competence. It should have been frustrating, but Ruth found herself responding to it. No coddling, no allowances made for her gender or her Eastern upbringing, just the expectation that she could learn and the space to prove it. On the fourth morning, he brought her to the fence line behind the barn where he'd set up a row of bottles on posts. "You ever held a gun before?" Cale's rifle rested easy in his hands, like it was part of him. "No." "All right. Watch first." He lifted the rifle to his shoulder in one smooth motion, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The leftmost bottle exploded into fragments. The sound cracked across the morning air, sharp enough to make Ruth flinch. He lowered the rifle and looked at her. "Your turn." Ruth took the weapon he offered, a smaller rifle, lighter than his. It was heavier than she'd expected, the wood warm from where his hands had been. "Stock against your shoulder, firm but not tight. You're bracing it, not strangling it." His hands came up to adjust her grip, impersonal and quick. "Sight down the barrel, line up the front and rear sights with your target. Breathe slow, squeeze the trigger, don't pull." Ruth tried to follow the instructions, but her arms were shaking from the weight and the newness of it all. "You're tensing up." Cale's voice came from just behind her shoulder. "The gun's not going to hurt you if you hold it right. Respect it, but don't fear it." She forced her muscles to relax, found the rhythm of her breathing. The bottle swam into focus between the sights. "Good. Now squeeze." The rifle kicked back into her shoulder hard enough to bruise, the sound deafening. The bottle remained intact, but dirt exploded a foot to the left of it. "Not bad for a first shot." Cale took the rifle back, reloaded it with practiced efficiency. "You pulled left at the last second, anticipated the recoil. Try again, and this time trust the gun to do what it's designed to do." They spent an hour there, Ruth firing until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. By the end, she'd managed to clip the edge of one bottle, sending it spinning off its post. "Better." Cale collected the spent shells, dropped them in his pocket. "We'll practice every few days until it's second nature." "Why?" Ruth rubbed her shoulder. "I understand defending against animals, but this seems excessive." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Because the world's not kind to women alone, Ruth, and there might come a day when I'm not here, and you need to be able to stand your ground." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply, but his expression was unreadable as always. "I'm not planning on being alone," she said carefully. "No one ever is." He started walking back toward the house. But planning and reality don't always align. The words hung between them, heavy with implications Ruth didn't want to examine too closely. That afternoon, while Kyle rode out to check fence lines on the southern boundary, Ruth discovered the locked room. She'd been exploring the upstairs more thoroughly, familiarizing herself with the house's layout and quirks. Most of the doors stood open or unlocked. The spare room she'd cleaned, a storage closet, even Kyle's own bedroom when he wasn't in it. But at the end of the hall, tucked into the corner, was a door that wouldn't budge. Ruth tried the handle again, felt the solid resistance of a lock. Strange. In a house where nothing else was secured, she bent down, peered through the keyhole, but could see nothing but darkness. "Looking for something?" Ruth straightened so fast she nearly lost her balance. Kyle stood at the top of the stairs, his expression hard. "I was just familiarizing myself with the house. I didn't realize that room stays locked." His voice was flat, final. "It's not part of your duties." Of course, I apologize for the intrusion. She moved past him toward the stairs, but his voice stopped her. Ruth. She turned back. Some of the hardness had left his face, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. It's not about trust. Some doors are locked for a reason that has nothing to do with keeping people out, and everything to do with keeping the past where it belongs. I understand, she said quietly. And she did, perhaps better than he knew. Weren't her own memories locked away just as firmly, just as deliberately? They didn't speak of it again, but something had shifted, a boundary acknowledged, a mutual recognition of the weight of what wasn't said. The second week brought the first real test. Ruth woke to the sound of panicked chickens and something else, a low, savage growling that raised every primitive alarm in her body. She was out of bed and halfway down the stairs before her conscious mind caught up, her nightgown billowing around her legs. Kale! She didn't care about propriety or volume. Something's in the chicken coop. His door flew open and he emerged already dressed, rifle in hand. How he dressed so fast she couldn't fathom, but there was no time to wonder. Stay inside, he ordered, already moving. The hell I will. Ruth grabbed the smaller rifle from where it hung by the door, checked it was loaded the way he'd taught her. You said I needed to defend this place too. Cale's eyes met hers, some furious argument playing out in his expression. Then he nodded sharply. Behind me. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot and I'm not in the way. They moved together through the pre-dawn darkness, the growling growing louder. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand stayed steady on the rifle. Fear was acceptable. Freezing was not. The chicken coop was chaos. Feathers everywhere, hens shrieking, and in the middle of it all, a coyote with its jaws locked around one of the birds. Cale didn't hesitate. He fired, the shot precise and clean. The coyote dropped, and the night went suddenly, eerily quiet. Check for others, Kyle said, already moving to secure the coop. They sometimes hunt in pairs. Ruth swept the area with her rifle raised, her eyes straining in the darkness. There, movement by the fence line. She tracked it, waiting, and a second coyote materialized from the shadows, yellow eyes gleaming. It saw her at the same moment she saw it. They froze, predator and prey, each assessing the other. Ruth. Cale's voice was low, careful. You have the shot? The coyote's muscles bunched. It was going to run or attack, and Ruth had seconds to decide which and how to respond. Everything Kyle had taught her about breathing and sighting and not anticipating the recoil crystallized in that moment. She fired. The coyote yelped and fled, her shot close enough to send it running, but not close enough to kill. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness beyond the fence. Ruth lowered the rifle, her whole body shaking now that it was over. Good, Kyle said, and she realized he'd moved to stand beside her. You didn't panic, and you made the right choice. Wounding shot was enough. You don't need to kill if you can scare them off. Bullets aren't free. He moved back to assess the damage. 3 hens dead, 2 others injured. Ruth helped him dispatch the injured ones quickly. There was no point in letting them suffer. By the time full dawn broke, they'd cleaned up the carnage and reinforced the weak point in the fence the coyotes had exploited. You did well tonight. Cale's praise was matter-of-fact as they walked back to the house, blood on their hands and exhaustion making them both sway. Most people freeze the first time they face something like that. I was terrified, Ruth admitted. Terror's fine. It's the freezing that kills you. He held the door for her. Get cleaned up. I'll make breakfast. Ruth climbed the stairs on legs that felt like water, her nightgown streaked with dirt and blood and feathers. In her room, she stripped it off and stood shaking in the cold morning air, looking at her hands. These hands had held a rifle steady enough to save their livestock. These hands had helped kill wounded animals without flinching. These hands were becoming something different than the soft, decorative things they'd been in Boston. She was becoming something different, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ruth felt something like pride. The town came to them 3 weeks after Ruth's arrival, though came to them was perhaps generous. Martha Yates made the trip with her husband driving the supply wagon, and with them came the weight of Dry Hollow's judgment. Ruth was in the garden, trying to coax the last of the season's vegetables into productivity when she heard the wagon. She stood, wiping dirt from her hands on the apron she'd learned to wear constantly, and watched them approach. Martha's expression was inscrutable as her husband stopped the wagon. Cale emerged from the barn, his own face carefully blank. Mrs. Yates, Tom, he nodded to each of them. Didn't expect supplies for another week. Brought them early. Tom Yates was a man of few words, his weathered face perpetually squinting against sun that wasn't there. Figured the girl might need extra. I'm managing fine with what we have, Ruth said, stepping forward. She didn't miss the way Martha's eyes traveled over her, taking in the simple work dress, the apron, the dirt under her nails, the new leanness in her face. Still here, then. Martha's tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. Still here, Ruth confirmed. That's 3 weeks longer than most. Tom started unloading supplies, and Cale moved to help him. Must be made of sterner stuff. Or more desperate, Martha said quietly, just loud enough for Ruth to hear. Ruth met her gaze steadily. Does it matter which if the result is the same? Something that might have been respect flickered in Martha's eyes. I suppose not, though desperation makes people do foolish things. So does judgment, Ruth countered. Foolish to write someone off before they've had a chance to prove themselves. Martha's lips twitched, almost a smile. You've got bite in you. That's good. You'll need it. While the men dealt with supplies, Martha followed Ruth toward the house. May I see the kitchen? I brought some preserves. Want to make sure you know how to store them proper. It was an obvious excuse, but Ruth led her inside anyway. Let Martha inspect, let her report back to town whatever she found. Ruth had nothing to hide. The kitchen was clean, organized, efficient. Martha took it all in with professional thoroughness, then turned to Ruth. You're keeping the place well. It's my job. It's more than that out here, and you know it. Martha set her basket on the table. The other women, they saw this as temporary, a means to an end, or a romantic notion, or just a mistake to escape from. You're different. How can you tell? Because you've unpacked. Martha gestured toward the small touches Ruth had added, a cloth on the table, herbs drying by the window, her own cup hanging by the stove. The others kept their trunks packed, ready to run. You're settling in. Ruth hadn't realized she'd done it, but Martha was right. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she'd stopped thinking of this as temporary and started treating it as home. Does that make me foolish or brave? Ruth asked. Probably both. Martha pulled jars from her basket, preserves, pickles, things to supplement the sparse winter diet ahead. But I'll tell you this, Cale Rourke is a hard man because this is hard land. He's not cruel, not dangerous like they whisper in town, but he's been alone a long time, and alone makes people... She searched for the word, rigid, set in their ways. If you're planning to stay, you'll need to be flexible enough for both of you. He's been fair to me, Ruth said carefully. Fair's not the same as easy, and when winter comes, when you're snowed in together for weeks with nothing but each other and the silence. Martha shook her head. That's when the real test comes. That's when the last 2 women broke and ran. Ruth thought of the locked room upstairs, of Cale's carefully maintained distance, of the way they moved around each other like dancers who knew the steps, but not the music. I'll manage, she said. Will you? Martha's eyes were kind but piercing. Because running from your past doesn't work if you're not willing to build a future. And futures require more than just surviving day to day. Before Ruth could respond, the men's voices carried through the open door. Cale's low rumble and Tom's occasional grunt. The supplies were unloaded. Martha gathered her basket. We'll be back at the first of the month. If you need anything before then, if things get... She paused delicately. Difficult, you send word. Tom will come. I won't need rescuing, Mrs. Yates. Every woman needs rescuing sometimes. The trick is knowing when to ask for it and when to rescue yourself. Martha moved toward the door, then turned back. One more thing. The town's planning a harvest dance next month. Everyone's expected to come, contribute food, show community spirit. Cale hasn't attended in years, but if you could convince him... I'm not here to change him, Ruth said firmly. No, but you're here, and that's already changed things whether you mean to or not. Martha's smile was sad. Just think about it, for both your sakes. After they left, Ruth found Cale in the barn, organizing the new supplies with mechanical precision. They came to inspect me, she said. I know. Does it bother you, the town watching, waiting for me to fail? Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on a sack of flour. They're not waiting for you to fail, Ruth. They're waiting for me to drive you away. There's a difference. Ruth stepped closer. You haven't driven me away. Not yet. His voice was rough. But winter's coming. Close quarters, long nights, too much time to think. That's when people's patience runs out. That's when they remember why they left in the first place. Is that what happened? With the others? He turned to face her, and in the dim light of the barn, his eyes looked almost haunted. The first one, like I said, expected romance. When she realized this was business, not courtship, she felt cheated. The second couldn't take the isolation, started talking to herself, seeing shadows. The third just couldn't do the work. He paused. But the fourth and fifth, they left because of who I am, what I am. Half native, Ruth said quietly. My mother's people were Lakota. My father was a trapper, Irish, mean as a snake when he drank. He died when I was young. My mother raised me on the reservation until she passed. Then I came here, bought this land with money I'd saved, built this ranch with my own hands. His jaw tightened. But the town sees my mother's blood and decides that makes me savage, dangerous, cursed. And the women you hired believed them. Eventually, the fourth lasted 2 months before the whispers got to her. Started seeing every normal thing as evidence of the curse. A cow died. Must be evil spirits. A storm came through. Must be divine punishment. By the end, she was terrified of me. His voice went flat. The fifth didn't even make it that long. Town convinced her I'd murdered my wife, a wife I've never had, and she fled in the night without even collecting her wages. Ruth felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. That's monstrous, the town's treatment of you. It's reality. Cale turned back to his work. And it's not going to change because you disapprove. If you stay, Ruth, you'll be painted with the same brush. The woman who lives with the savage. The woman who doesn't know better or doesn't care. Your reputation will suffer. My reputation was already destroyed, Ruth said quietly. That's why I'm here. His hand stilled. What happened to you back east? Ruth had known this question would come eventually, had rehearsed various answers, various levels of truth, but standing here in the barn with this man who'd been honest about his own wounds, she found she couldn't lie. I was engaged, to a man from a good family with prospects and connections, everything my father wanted for me. Her voice was steady, clinical. 3 months before the wedding, I discovered he was already married, had been for years. I was to be his mistress with a prettier title. Kael's expression darkened. And your family? Blame me for not knowing sooner, for embarrassing them when I called off the engagement without explaining why, because explaining would have caused scandal. Ruth's laugh was bitter. My father gave me a choice. Marry someone else quickly and quietly, or leave. I chose to leave. That took courage. It took desperation. There's a difference. Ruth met his eyes. So you see, Kael, I understand about reputations built on lies, about being judged for things beyond your control, and I understand about choosing survival over comfort. For a long moment, they stood in the dusty light of the barn, two people shaped by different cruelties into complementary scars. The harvest dance, Kael said abruptly. Martha mentioned it? She did. I don't go. Haven't in years. She said as much. But if you want to go, I'll take you. Let you see the town. Meet people. You don't have to be as isolated as I choose to be. Ruth considered this carefully. If I go, we go together. I'm not interested in being paraded around as the latest curiosity. Something that might have been relief crossed his face. Then we don't go. I didn't say that. Ruth moved closer. I said if we go together, as partners. Let them see that you're not alone anymore and that I'm not afraid. It'll make things harder for you. Things are already hard. At least this way we choose how to face it. She held his gaze. Unless you'd rather I hide away, pretend I'm just hired help with no stake in how this town sees you. You are just hired help. Am I? Ruth challenged. Because it seems to me I've bled for this place, fought for it, defended it. That makes me more than just someone who cooks your meals. Kyle stared at her, and Ruth watched the internal battle play out on his face. Control versus trust. Isolation versus connection. The safety of keeping everyone at arm's length versus the risk of letting someone in. "We'll go," he said finally. "To the dance. Together." It felt like a victory, small but significant. Ruth nodded. "Then I'll need to know how to make something worth contributing. What do people bring to these things?" "Pies, usually. Cakes, whatever preserves or goods they can spare." He paused. "Can you bake?" "I can learn." The ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "That seems to be your answer to everything." "It's worked so far." The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparation. Ruth learned to bake in the temperamental stove, ruining her first 3 attempts at pie crust before finally mastering the technique. Kyle brought her apples from a wild tree on the northern boundary, and she made preserves, filling the house with the smell of cinnamon and sugar. They worked side by side more now, the initial wariness giving way to something like companionship. Cale taught her to ride, patient through her failures and generous with his rare praise when she succeeded. Ruth began to understand the land the way he did, reading weather in the clouds, understanding the patterns of the animals, knowing which fence lines needed constant attention and which held firm. But underneath it all, Ruth felt the weight of what Martha had said. Winter was coming, and with it, the real test. Already the nights were colder, the days shorter. Soon they'd be snowed in, trapped together in close quarters with nowhere to run and nothing to distract them from each other. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, Ruth found herself almost curious. Who would they become to each other when survival required more than just coexistence? She got a glimpse of it one evening when a storm rolled in, sudden and vicious. Ruth was in the garden trying to save what she could when the first drops fell. Within minutes, it was a deluge, rain so thick she could barely see the house. She ran for shelter, already soaked through, and slammed into something solid. Cale's hands caught her arms, steadying her. "Get inside!" he shouted over the thunder. "I need to secure the barn." "I'll help." "You'll get killed. Lightning's too close." But Ruth was already moving, following him through the rain toward the barn, where the door had blown open, banging violently against the frame. Together they fought it closed, Kael's strength and Ruth's determination combining to force the wind back. Inside the barn was chaos. Bessie the cow lowed in distress. The chickens they'd moved inside for safety were panicking, and something was loose in the loft, crashing around. "Check the animals!" Cale was already climbing the ladder to the loft. "Make sure nothing's gotten out." Ruth moved through the barn, her wet dress clinging to her, checking each stall and pen. Everything was secure, just frightened. She was murmuring calm words to Bessie when a crack of thunder so loud it felt physical shook the building. And then, from the loft, "Ruth, move!" She looked up and dove sideways on pure instinct. A section of the loft floor gave way, boards and hay cascading down where she'd been standing seconds before. "You hurt?" Cale was down the ladder faster than should have been possible, his hands running over her shoulders, her arms, checking for damage. "I'm fine." "What happened?" "Rot in the supports. I've been meaning to fix it, but..." He swore viciously. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't." Ruth caught his hands, stilling their frantic movement. "I'm fine, Kael." He was breathing hard, and in the dim light of the barn, she could see something raw in his eyes. Fear. Actual fear. "If something happened to you..." He stopped, seemed to catch himself. "Nothing happened," Ruth said quietly. "We're both fine." The storm raged outside, but inside the barn time seemed to suspend. They were still holding hands, still standing too close. The adrenaline and fear and relief all mixing into something neither of them quite knew how to name. Kyle pulled back first, clearing his throat. "Storm should pass in an hour or so. We should wait it out here rather than risk running back to the house." They settled in the hay, backs against the wall, listening to the rain hammer the roof. Somewhere in the comfortable silence, Ruth's eyes began to close. She woke to find her head on Kael's shoulder and his coat draped over her for warmth. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and new in its wake. Kael was still awake, staring at nothing, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "How long was I asleep?" Ruth's voice was rough. "Hour, maybe." He didn't move away. "You were exhausted." "You could have woken me." "You needed rest more than I needed conversation." Ruth sat up and immediately missed the warmth of him. "Thank you for the coat." Don't thank me for basic decency. But his voice was gentle. They walked back to the house through mud and puddles, the world transformed by the storm. Ruth made hot coffee while Cale changed into dry clothes, and they sat at the kitchen table as dawn began to break. "The dance is in 3 days," Ruth said. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Constantly." But he met her eyes. "But I gave my word. We can still back out. I won't think less of you." "Won't you?" Cale's smile was sad. "I would. I've spent years hiding from that town, letting their judgment keep me isolated. Maybe it's time to stop running." Ruth thought of her own flight from Boston, from judgment and expectation. Running toward something is different than running away. Is it? Or is that just what we tell ourselves to feel better about being cowards? The bluntness of it hung in the air. Then Ruth laughed, surprising them both. "Perhaps we're both cowards then. But at least we're honest cowards." Bossy Cale's laugh, when it came, was rusty from disuse, but genuine. "I suppose there's something to be said for that." The night of the harvest dance arrived with unseasonable warmth and a sky full of stars. Ruth dressed in her best remaining dress, dark green with modest trim, nothing fancy but respectable. When she came downstairs, she found Kyle waiting in clothes she'd never seen him wear, clean trousers, a pressed shirt, even a string tie. He looked uncomfortable and handsome in equal measure. "You clean up well," Ruth said. "So do you." His eyes traveled over her, quick but appreciative. "You ready for this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." They rode to town together, Ruth side saddle now that she'd learned the basics of riding, Kyle silent and tense beside her. As they approached Dry Hollow, they could hear music and laughter, could see lanterns strung between buildings. The moment they rode into the light, the music faltered. Conversation died. Every head turned. Ruth felt Kyle tense beside her, readying himself for rejection. But she was done letting fear make decisions. She dismounted without waiting for help, took the basket of pies from where they'd secured it, and walked straight toward Martha Yates with her head high. "Mrs. Yates, we brought apple pies for the dessert table. Ruth made them herself, and they're excellent." Martha's surprise was evident, but she recovered quickly. "Well, thank you. Put them over there, dear." Ruth did, very aware of the eyes on her, the whispers starting. She turned back to where Kyle still sat on his horse, frozen. "Are you coming, or shall I dance with Tom Yates all evening?" That got him moving. He dismounted, tied off the horse, and joined her. Together, they walked into the heart of the gathering. It was the longest night of Ruth's life. The whispers followed them like shadows as they made their way through the crowd. Ruth kept her chin high, her hand light on Kyle's arm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She could feel the weight of every stare, could hear the fragments of conversation that weren't quite quiet enough. Lasted longer than the others, I'll give her that. Poor thing doesn't know what she's gotten into. Mark my words, she'll be gone by Christmas. Cale's jaw was tight enough to crack stone, but he kept walking. They found a spot near the edge of the gathering where they could observe without being surrounded, and Ruth finally allowed herself to breathe. "This was a mistake," Kyle said quietly. "No, this was necessary." Ruth scanned the crowd, noting the clusters of people, the ones who looked curious versus those who looked hostile. Running only works if you never plan to stop. We're not running anymore. Before Kyle could respond, a man detached himself from a group near the punch table and headed their way. He was tall, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the kind of confidence that came from money or position or both. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well, Cale Rourke gracing us with his presence. It's been what, 3 years since you last showed your face in town?" "4, Kyle said flatly. "Carson." "4 then." The man's attention shifted to Ruth, and she didn't like what she saw in his expression. Appraisal that felt too intimate, too assessing. "And this must be the famous 6th woman. Ruth Calder, isn't it?" "Miss Calder," Ruth corrected, her voice cool. "And you are?" "Jacob Carson. I own the bank and half the businesses in this town." He said it like it was an achievement worth celebrating. "I have to say, Miss Calder, you're either braver or more desperate than your predecessors. Most had the sense to leave before winter set in." Perhaps I have more sense than you credit me with, Mr. Carson. Enough to know that other people's failures don't predict my own. Carson's smile sharpened. Confident. I like that. Though confidence and reality have a way of parting company out here. He turned to Kyle. Speaking of reality, I heard you lost 3 head to rustlers last month. That's a significant loss for an operation your size. Handled it, Kyle said shortly. Did you? Because from where I'm standing, you're barely holding on. One bad winter, one more setback, and that land of yours will be available for someone with the resources to actually make it profitable. Ruth felt Kyle go rigid beside her. She stepped forward slightly, inserting herself into Carson's line of sight. Mr. Carson, do you make a habit of circling wounded prey, or is that just a hobby you pursue at social gatherings? The nearby conversations faltered. Carson's expression darkened. I beg your pardon? You should. Begging pardon, I mean. Since you're clearly trying to provoke Mr. Rourke at what's supposed to be a community celebration. Ruth's voice was pleasant, conversational, and utterly cutting. Unless you have actual business to discuss, perhaps you could take your speculation elsewhere. For a long moment, Carson stared at her. Then he laughed, though it sounded forced. You've got yourself a spirited one, Rourke. Let's hope her spirit lasts longer than her predecessors did. He walked away, but Ruth could feel the attention his confrontation had drawn. More whispers, more speculation. She turned to find Kyle looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did. He was trying to humiliate you in front of the whole town. He succeeded. No. Ruth caught his arm. He tried. There's a difference, and the only way he succeeds is if we let him see it hurt. Kyle's mouth quirked slightly. You have experience with men like Carson. Unfortunately, Ruth thought of her father's business associates, of the men who'd circled when her engagement fell apart, sensing opportunity in her ruin. They're all the same, whether they're in Boston or the frontier. They measure worth in ownership and see vulnerability as invitation. And how do you handle them? By refusing to be vulnerable. She met his eyes. By standing my ground and making them work for every inch they try to take. Something in Kyle's expression shifted, softened. You're not what I expected when I placed that advertisement. What did you expect? Someone desperate enough not to ask questions, someone who'd keep her head down and just work. He paused. Someone forgettable. Ruth felt the compliment beneath the words, the acknowledgement that she was none of those things. Before she could respond, music started up, a fiddle joined by a guitar, playing something quick and bright. Couples began moving toward the makeshift dance floor, and Ruth watched them with an ache she hadn't expected. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself the simple pleasure of music, of movement, of something that wasn't about survival. I don't dance, Kyle said, reading her expression. Of course you don't. Ruth tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. But you want to. It's fine. We came. We showed our faces. That's enough. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, watching the dancers spin and turn. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. My mother taught me, before she died, said dancing was prayer made visible, that movement connected you to the earth and sky. Ruth looked at him sharply. He was staring at the dancers, but his eyes were far away, lost in memory. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, strong in ways my father never understood. He thought strength was volume and violence. She knew it was endurance and adaptation. Kyle's voice was rough with old grief. She died when I was 14. Pneumonia, they said. But I think it was heartbreak. Missing her people, her land, trapped in a life my father forced on her. Ruth's heart clenched. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But the way he said it suggested time hadn't dulled the loss much. She'd be disappointed in me, I think, hiding out at the ranch, avoiding the world. She believed in facing things head on. Then let's face this. Ruth held out her hand. Dance with me. For her, if not for yourself. Kyle stared at her offered hand like it was a trap or a test or something equally dangerous. People will talk. People are already talking. Let's give them something worth discussing. For a heartbeat, Ruth thought he'd refuse. Then his hand closed around hers, rough and warm and solid, and he led her onto the dance floor. The music was fast, a reel that required more enthusiasm than skill. Kyle moved with surprising grace, his hand firm at her waist, guiding her through turns she barely knew. Ruth laughed, breathless and exhilarated, forgetting for a moment about the watching eyes and whispered judgments. This was joy, pure and uncomplicated. This was connection, two people moving together in shared rhythm. This was what she'd been missing without even knowing it. When the song ended, they were both breathing hard. Kael's hand lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and Ruth saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with the dancing. Then the moment shattered. A man Ruth didn't recognize pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with drink or anger, or both. Well, isn't this cozy? The savage and his latest woman playing at being civilized. The music died. Conversation stopped. The entire gathering turned to watch. Kael's hand dropped from Ruth's waist. His expression went cold and distant, all the warmth from moments before extinguished like a candle in wind. Walk away, Peters. Why should I? This is a public gathering, and I've got a right to speak my mind. Peters swayed slightly, definitely drunk. We all know what you are, Rourke. Know what your mother's people did to good Christian settlers? Blood doesn't wash away that easy. My mother's people fought to protect their land from invaders, Kyle said, his voice dangerously quiet. They had that right. Rights? Peters laughed harshly. Savages don't have rights. They got what they deserved, and you, Ruth didn't think. She moved between them, her voice cutting through Peters' drunken tirade like a blade. That's enough. Peters blinked at her, surprised. This doesn't concern you, woman. It concerns me absolutely. You're insulting my employer in public, maligning an entire people based on ignorance and liquor, and ruining what was a perfectly pleasant evening. Ruth's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. So yes, Mr. Peters, it concerns me very much. Your employer, Peters sneered. Is that what we're calling it now? Everyone knows what you really are to him, just like the others. The implication hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Ruth felt rage rise in her throat, hot and bitter. I am his housekeeper, his employee. Nothing more and nothing less, regardless of what your small mind imagines. She stepped closer to Peters, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. And even if I were more, even if there were romance or partnership or anything else between us, it would still be none of your business and certainly none of your concern. You don't know what you're defending, Peters said. The curse is real. Women die out at that ranch. His own kind put a hex on that land, and anyone fool enough to stay, there is no curse. Ruth's voice rang out across the silent gathering. There's only a man trying to build something despite the active hostility of his neighbors. There's only narrow-minded prejudice dressed up as concern. And there's only the cowardice of people who'd rather believe in curses than face their own failures at basic human decency. The silence that followed was absolute. Ruth could feel every eye on her, could sense Kael's tension at her back, could see Martha Yates's shocked expression and Jacob Carson's calculating one. Peter's face went purple with rage. You're as crazy as the others. Give it time, woman. Give it time and you'll see I'm right. He stormed off into the darkness, and slowly, uncertainly, conversation began to resume around them. But it was different now. The evening had turned, gone sour and tense. We should go, Kyle said quietly, his hand light on Ruth's elbow. But Martha Yates intercepted them before they could leave. Her expression was complex, equal parts concern and something that might have been admiration. That took guts, girl, she said quietly. Foolish, maybe, but gutsy. I won't stand by and let someone spew hatred unchallenged, Ruth said. No, I don't suppose you will. Martha glanced at Kyle, then back to Ruth. But you should know, Peters isn't wrong about the talk, about what people think you are to each other. Let them think what they want, Ruth said tiredly. Their thoughts don't change reality. Don't they? Martha's voice was gentle. Because out here, reputation is reality. And you've just tied yours to his in a way that can't be undone. Ruth understood what she was saying. By defending Kyle so publicly, so passionately, she'd confirmed every whisper and suspicion. The town would never see her as just his housekeeper now. She'd be his woman, his partner, his defender, whether that was true or not. I can live with that, Ruth said quietly. Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you can. Question is, can he? She walked away, leaving Ruth to find Kael waiting by the horses, his face unreadable in the lamplight. They rode home in silence, the night air cold against their skin. Ruth replayed the evening in her mind, wondering if she'd made things better or worse, if her defense had helped or merely painted a larger target on both their backs. You didn't have to do that, Kael said finally, his voice rough. What you said to Peters. To all of them. Yes, I did. Why? You barely know me. And now the whole town thinks... I know what they think. Ruth kept her eyes on the dark road ahead. I knew what they'd think the moment I defended you against Carson. I knew, and I did it anyway. Why? He asked again, and this time there was genuine confusion in his voice. Ruth thought about how to answer. She could deflect, could make it about principle or justice or simple human decency. All of that would be true, but incomplete. Because I'm tired of watching good people be torn down by small-minded ones, she said finally. Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control. And because... She paused, searching for the right words. Because when I look at what you've built, what you've endured, what you keep fighting for despite everything, I see something worth defending. The ranch appeared ahead, a dark shape against the star-filled sky. Kael brought the horse to a stop in the yard, but didn't immediately dismount. My mother used to say that some people are born to stand alone, he said quietly. That they're given strength for solitude because they'll never fit with the crowd. I always thought I was one of those people. Maybe you were. Before. Ruth turned to look at him. But people can change. Circumstances can change. What worked when you were alone might not be what works now. Now that you're here... It wasn't a question, but Ruth answered anyway. Now that I'm here... Kael helped her down from the horse, and for a moment they stood close in the darkness, the warmth of the animal at their backs and the cold of the night pressing in around them. Thank you, he said finally, for tonight, for standing with me. We stand together, Ruth corrected. That's what partnership means. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Is that what this is? Partnership? What else would you call it? Kael was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the starlight. I don't know, but it's more than I expected. More than I thought I'd have again. Again. The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Ruth wanted to ask what he meant, who he'd had before, what he'd lost. But the moment felt too fragile, too new. Instead, she said simply, Get some rest. Morning comes early. She left him with the horse and went inside, her legs shaking from more than just exhaustion. The evening had changed something fundamental between them, had shifted the ground they stood on in ways she couldn't fully articulate yet. Upstairs, Ruth changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the dance in her mind. The feel of Kael's hand at her waist, the rare smile on his face, the moment of pure connection before everything fell apart. She'd come to this ranch looking for control over her own life. What she hadn't expected was how that life would begin to intertwine with someone else's. How defending him would feel less like obligation and more like instinct. It was dangerous, this growing connection. Dangerous because it meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was what had destroyed her in Boston. But it was also intoxicating, this sense of being part of something larger than her own survival. Sleep came late and brought dreams of dancing, of Kael's hands guiding her through steps she didn't know, of music that never stopped even as the world tried to silence it. The aftermath of the dance revealed itself over the following days. Tom Yates arrived 3 days later with supplies and news, his weathered face grave. Thought you should know, he said as Kael helped him unload. Peters has been talking around town, saying things about Miss Calder, about what she must be doing out here to stay so long. Kael's hand stilled on a sack of grain. What kind of things? The kind that question her virtue and your intentions. Tom glanced toward the house where Ruth was working in the garden. He's also been talking to Carson, stirring up trouble about your land rights, saying the ranch should go to someone who can properly manage it. My land rights are solid. I've got the deed filed proper. Deeds can be challenged if there's question about improvements, about active use. Tom's voice was careful. Carson's been making noise about how you're barely profitable, how the land's going to waste. If he can build a case that you're not maintaining the property adequately, he can petition to have it seized and auctioned, Kyle finished grimly. That's about the size of it. Tom shifted uncomfortably. I'm not saying he'll succeed, but he's got money and influence, and you've got a reputation as a savage and a woman everyone thinks is my mistress. Kael's laugh was bitter. Perfect ammunition. Ruth appeared from the garden, dirt on her hands and concern on her face. What's happened? Tom explained again, more gently this time. Ruth listened with growing anger, her eyes flashing. That's absurd. This ranch is well maintained. Anyone can see the work you've put into it. Maintenance isn't just about buildings and fences, Tom said. It's about profitability, about proving the land is being used to its full potential. Carson will argue that a larger operation with more hands and resources could do more with the same acreage. So he wants to steal it out from under you legally. Ruth's voice was flat. He wants to buy it at auction for a fraction of its worth, then sell it at profit or incorporate it into his own holdings. Kael's jaw was tight. It's what he does, how he built his empire. What can we do? Ruth asked. We? Kael looked at her sharply. This isn't your fight, Ruth. Yes, it is. You think if Carson succeeds in taking this ranch, I'll just find another position somewhere? My reputation is already destroyed thanks to Peter's gossip. Where exactly do you think I'll go? Her voice softened slightly. Besides, I told you, we stand together. That includes fights worth having. Tom cleared his throat. There might be a way. If you could prove increased productivity, expansion of operations, it would make the case for seizure weaker. Show that the land is being actively developed, not just maintained. With what money? Kael gestured around them. I'm barely breaking even as it is. The rustlers took 3 head, and beef prices are down. I can't afford to hire hands for expansion. What about the northern pasture? Ruth asked suddenly. You said it's not being used because you don't have enough hands to manage it. It's too far from the main operation. Would need a line shack, regular patrols, someone dedicated to managing that herd separately. So we build a line shack. We manage it ourselves. Kael stared at her. Do you understand what you're suggesting? That's weeks of hard labor, and then constant work maintaining 2 separate operations. It would mean you're out there alone sometimes while I'm here, or vice versa. I understand perfectly. Ruth met his eyes. I also understand that the alternative is losing everything you've built. So we make it work. Tom watched this exchange with interest, something like approval in his eyes. There's another thing might help. Community standing. If you had allies in town, people willing to vouch for the ranch's value and your management. I don't have allies in town, Kyle said flatly. You might have more than you think. Tom glanced at Ruth. What you did at the dance, standing up to Peters, defending Kael publicly, there were folks who admired that. Folks tired of Carson running roughshod over anyone who doesn't fit his vision of what Dry Hollow should be. Admiration doesn't translate to support, Kael pointed out. No, but it's a start. Tom hefted another sack. Martha and I will speak on your behalf if it comes to that. And there are others who might do the same if they see you're serious about making this work. About being part of the community instead of hiding from it. After Tom left, Ruth found Kyle in the barn, staring at nothing. You're thinking it's impossible, she said. I'm thinking it's a lot of work for uncertain results. And I'm thinking you're risking your safety and reputation for a fight that might already be lost. Ruth sat beside him on the hay bale, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Tell me about the northern pasture. What would it really take? Kyle was quiet for a moment, then sighed. The land is good. Better grazing than down here, actually. There's water from a creek that runs year-round. But it's 10 miles out, rough terrain. We'd need to build a shelter, string fence line, move maybe 20 head up there to start. Then someone would need to ride out regularly to check on them, move them as needed, watch for predators and rustlers. So we do it. Build the shelter together, move the cattle, set up a rotation for checking on them. Ruth, you don't know how to build a shelter. Hell, you barely knew how to ride a month ago. Then teach me. She turned to face him fully. You've taught me everything else. Why not this? Because it's dangerous. Because you could get hurt. Because he stopped abruptly. Because what? Kyle stood, pacing the narrow confines of the barn. Because I've already lost too much to this land. I won't lose you too. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unplanned. Ruth's breath caught. You won't lose me, she said quietly. I'm not the others, Kale. I don't scare easy, and I don't run. Everyone runs eventually. Then I suppose I'm not everyone. Ruth stood, moving to stand in his path. I understand you're afraid. After everything that's happened, everyone who's left, I understand why trust doesn't come easy. But I need you to hear me. I am staying. Whether we fight Carson or not, whether we build the line shack or not, I am staying. Kyle searched her face, looking for doubt or deception or the weakness that would prove his fears right. But Ruth met his gaze steadily, letting him see the determination that had brought her 1,000 miles to stand in this barn, having this conversation. Why? He asked finally, his voice rough. Why does it matter to you this much? Because for the first time in my life, I'm building something instead of running from something. Because this place, this work, it matters. It's real in a way nothing in my old life ever was. Ruth paused. And because you matter. What we're building together, it matters. For a long moment, Kyle said nothing. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. To me too. The next morning, they rode out to survey the northern pasture. The land rolled away in golden waves, the creek cutting a green ribbon through the center. It was beautiful in a stark, honest way. No pretense, no decoration, just earth and sky and the promise of what could be built with enough determination. There, Cale pointed to a rise sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. That's where we'd put the line shack. High enough to avoid flooding, trees for windbreak, clear view of the surrounding area. Ruth could see it. A small, sturdy building, rough but functional. A place of their own making, proof that they could create something from nothing. When do we start? Tomorrow, if the weather holds. Kyle dismounted, helping Ruth down. It'll take 2, maybe 3 weeks to build. Hard work, long days. I'm not afraid of hard work. No. His slight smile was almost fond. You're really not, are you? They spent an hour marking out dimensions, discussing materials, planning the work ahead. Ruth watched Kyle transform as he talked, the tension leaving his shoulders, enthusiasm replacing the defensive wariness that was his usual armor. This was who he was beneath the scars, she realized. Someone who loved building, creating, making order from chaos. The town had tried to break that out of him, but it had only driven it underground. My father was a builder, Ruth said suddenly. Not construction, business. He built companies, partnerships, empires of trade and influence. She knelt, running her fingers through the soil. I used to watch him work and wonder what it felt like to create something lasting, something that would outlive you. And now you know? Now I think I'm beginning to understand. Ruth looked up at him. It's not about immortality or legacy or any of that grand thinking. It's about doing work that matters while you're here, about leaving things better than you found them. Kyle crouched beside her, his hands resting on his knees. Your father, he's still alive. As far as I know. We don't speak. Haven't since I left. Do you miss him? Ruth considered this honestly. I miss who I thought he was. The man I imagined when I was young, before I understood that his love was conditional on my compliance. But the real man? No. I don't miss being small enough to fit into his vision of who I should be. I understand that, Kyle said quietly. My father wanted me to be white, or at least to act like it, to deny my mother's people, her teachings, everything that made me who I am. When I refused, when I claimed her heritage publicly, he shook his head. He couldn't stand the sight of me, drank himself to death rather than live with the disappointment of a son who wouldn't pretend. I'm sorry. Don't be. His death freed me to build this. Cale gestured to the land around them. To claim something entirely my own, not tainted by his hatred or the town's judgment. This ranch, it's mine. Bought with money I earned, built with my own hands. No one can say I stole it or inherited it or don't deserve it. Except Carson. Except Carson, Kyle agreed grimly. which is why we're going to fight. Why we're going to build that line shack and expand the herd and prove that this land is being worked to its potential. Ruth stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Then we'd better get started. They rode back to the ranch as afternoon faded toward evening, already making lists of materials needed and tasks to be completed. Ruth felt something light and fierce in her chest. Hope, maybe, or the thrill of a worthy challenge. That night, after dinner, Kyle pulled out his ledgers and began showing her the finances of the operation. Ruth had some head for numbers from watching her father's business dealings, and she quickly grasped the precarious balance Kyle was maintaining. If we can get 20 head established in the northern pasture and see them through to spring calving, that's potentially 40 head total, she calculated. At current market prices, even accounting for losses, it could mean the difference between barely surviving and actually thriving, Kyle finished. But it's a gamble. If we lose the herd to weather or predators or rustlers, we're worse off than before. Life is a gamble, Ruth countered. The question isn't whether to risk, it's whether the potential gain is worth the potential loss. And you think it is? Ruth looked around the kitchen, their kitchen now, in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with belonging. She thought of the northern pasture waiting to be claimed, of the line shack they would build together, of the future that was no longer just survival, but actual growth. Yes, she said firmly. I think it is. Kyle studied her across the table, and Ruth saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. Not just respect or partnership, but something warmer, something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. Then we do it, he said. Together. The word carried weight beyond the immediate decision. Together meant partnership. Together meant trust. Together meant that somewhere along the way, without either of them quite meaning to, they'd become something more than employer and employee, more than two people sharing space. Together meant they'd become a unit worth fighting for. Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first real hint of the winter to come. But inside, by lamplight and shared purpose, they began to plan their war against those who would take what they'd built. And Ruth thought that perhaps this planning, this partnership, this quiet determination in the face of opposition, this was what she'd been running toward all along. The work began at dawn the next day, and it was harder than Ruth had imagined. They hauled lumber from town on a borrowed wagon, Tom Yates extending them credit that spoke of quiet faith Ruth hadn't expected. The timber was rough cut and heavy, and by the end of the first day, Ruth's hands were blistered despite the gloves Cale insisted she wear. We can slow down, he said that evening, watching her struggle to hold her fork. There's no race. Yes, there is. Ruth forced herself to eat, knowing her body needed fuel. Every day we delay is another day Carson can build his case. We finish this fast and we finish it right. Kyle said nothing, but the next morning he'd fashioned crude padding for the inside of her gloves and showed her how to wrap her hands beneath them. Small kindnesses that spoke louder than words. They fell into a rhythm over the following days. Up before dawn, quick breakfast. Then the long ride to the northern pasture with supplies loaded on a packhorse. They worked side by side, Kyle teaching Ruth how to measure and cut, how to join beams so they'd hold against wind and weather, how to think 3 steps ahead so nothing was wasted. Ruth learned that building was as much about patience as strength. That rushing led to mistakes that cost time to fix. She learned to read the land the way Kyle did, understanding how water would flow, where wind would hit hardest, which direction to face the structure for maximum shelter. And she learned about Kyle in ways that working together revealed. The way he went quiet when concentrating, his brow furrowed and his movements precise. The way he'd pause sometimes and just look at the land, drinking it in like water. The way his rare smiles came more easily now, especially when Ruth surprised him with competence he hadn't expected. You're a quick study, he said one afternoon as she finished notching a beam properly on her first try. I had good teachers. My mother insisted I learn practical skills despite my father's protests. Ruth wiped sweat from her forehead. She said a woman who could only be decorative would never survive real hardship. Your mother sounds wise. She was. She died when I was 16. After that, my father tried to mold me into the perfect ornamental daughter, but some of what she taught had already taken root too deep. Ruth ran her hand along the smooth wood. I think she'd approve of this, of me doing work that matters. She'd be proud, Kyle said quietly. I know I am. The words settled around Ruth's heart like a warm blanket. Praise from Kyle was rare and never given lightly. She ducked her head to hide the flush of pleasure and picked up the next beam. By the end of the second week, the line shack had walls and a roof. It was small, barely larger than Ruth's bedroom at the main house, but it was solid. They'd built it to last, every joint tight, every board secured. Standing inside it felt like standing inside proof that impossible things could be made real through sheer determination. We need to celebrate, Ruth said, looking around at their work. Celebrate how? We're 10 miles from the nearest bottle of whiskey. I brought supplies. Ruth pulled out the small pack she'd carried separately. Inside were 2 tin cups, a thermos of coffee that was probably still warm, and a small cake she'd baked the night before and wrapped carefully. Kael's expression softened as she unpacked it all. You planned this. I planned for the possibility. Ruth poured coffee into both cups, handed him one. To the line shack. May it stand as long as this ranch does. They touched cups, the metallic clink small but significant in the evening quiet. The coffee was lukewarm but good, and the cake was slightly crushed from the ride but edible. They sat on the floor of their new building as the sun set through the open door, painting the world in amber and gold. What happens now? Ruth asked. Now we move the cattle, 20 head like we planned. Get them settled before the first snow. Cale bit into the cake, chewed thoughtfully. Then we start the rotation. One of us here every 3 days or so, checking on them, moving them to fresh grazing, watching for trouble. You mean you'll be here? I'll stay at the main ranch. I mean we'll both rotate through. Kyle looked at her seriously. You're as capable as any hand I could hire, Ruth. More so because you care about this place, about making it work. You trust me with that? Ruth couldn't quite keep the surprise from her voice. I trust you with everything. The words were simple, but the way he said them made Ruth's breath catch. You've earned that these past weeks. Your competence, your commitment, your refusal to quit when things get hard. Ruth set down her cup, her hands suddenly unsteady. Cale, I know we haven't talked about it, about what this is between us. He met her eyes. But it's more than employment, Ruth. Has been for a while now, if I'm honest. What is it then? Partnership, friendship. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. The potential for more, if you're willing, if that's something you'd want. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. This was dangerous territory, the kind that led to vulnerability and risk and all the things she'd sworn off after Boston. But this was also Kyle, who'd been nothing but honest with her, who'd taught her and trusted her and built something real beside her. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about it, she admitted quietly. But I'm afraid. Of what people will say, of what it might mean, of losing what we have if we reach for more. All valid fears. Kyle shifted closer, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. But fear's a poor reason to avoid something that could be good. Important. Is that what you think this could be? Important? I think you're the first person in years who's made me believe I could have more than just survival. That I could have partnership, companionship, maybe even... He stopped, shook his head. It's too soon. I'm moving too fast. Maybe, Ruth said. Or maybe we've been moving toward this since the day I arrived and we're just now catching up to it. She reached out, let her fingers brush his. I'm not ready to name what this is. Not yet, but I'm willing to let it become what it wants to be if you are. Cale's hand closed around hers, rough and warm and solid. I can work with that. They sat there as darkness fell, hands joined, the future uncertain but no longer quite so frightening. Outside, the first stars appeared, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. The next week was consumed with moving cattle. It was grueling, dangerous work that required both of them in the saddle from dawn until well past dark. The cattle were ornery, the terrain was rough, and every day brought new challenges, a stubborn steer that refused to move, a near stampede when something spooked the herd, a tense standoff with a mountain lion that watched from the rocks, but ultimately decided easier prey lay elsewhere. By the time they got all 20 head settled in the northern pasture, Ruth was so exhausted she could barely stay upright. But they'd done it. The expansion was real, tangible, provable. That should give Carson pause, Ruth said as they rode back to the main ranch under a sky threatening snow. Maybe. Or it'll just make him push harder, prove we can't sustain it. Kyle's voice was tired but satisfied. Either way, we've shown what we can do. That counts for something. The first snow came that night, not the gentle dusting Ruth had imagined, but a full blizzard that howled around the house and piled drifts against the doors. Ruth woke to a world transformed, everything buried under white, the familiar landscape made alien and new. We can't get to the northern pasture in this, Kyle said over breakfast, his expression tight with worry. The cattle are on their own until it clears. Will they be all right? Should be. There's shelter in the trees and the creek won't freeze for another few weeks, but I don't like leaving them unchecked. He stared out the window at the swirling white. Nothing to do but wait it out. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days trapped inside with only each other for company, the isolation Martha had warned about becoming visceral reality. But to Ruth's surprise, it wasn't frightening. It was almost peaceful. They played cards by firelight, Ruth teaching Kyle games from her childhood, and Kyle teaching her a game his mother had played. They talked about everything and nothing, childhoods and dreams and the 100 small observations that make up a life. They cooked together, cleaned together, existed in a companionable proximity that felt natural rather than forced. On the third night, Kyle asked about the locked room again, obliquely. "My mother's things are in there," he said as they sat by the fire. "Her clothes, her tools for beadwork, the few books she owned. I locked it after she died because looking at them hurt too much. Kept meaning to go through it, but," he shrugged. "Time passed. It got easier to just keep it closed." "Do you want to open it?" Ruth asked carefully. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should. Let go, move forward. But part of me is afraid that if I do, I'll lose the last piece of her I have left." Ruth understood that fear intimately. "Things aren't people, Kyle. Opening that room won't make her less real or less important. It might actually let her memory breathe a little." He considered this, staring into the flames. "Would you come with me? When I do it?" Of course. They didn't do it that night, but the offer had been made and accepted. Another layer of trust, another brick in the foundation they were building together. When the storm finally cleared, they rode out to check on the northern herd. The line shack had held perfectly. The cattle had weathered the storm in the sheltered valley, and Ruth felt a surge of fierce pride at what they'd accomplished. But the peace didn't last long. They returned to find a rider waiting at the main ranch, one of Carson's men, holding an official-looking document. "What's this?" Cale's voice was hard as he dismounted. "Notice of assessment," the man said, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Carson's filed a petition with the Territorial Land Office, claims you're not meeting the requirements for maintained ownership. They're sending an assessor in 2 weeks to evaluate." Ruth felt cold that had nothing to do with the snow. "On what grounds?" "Insufficient improvements, minimal profitability, failure to develop the land to its potential." The man wouldn't meet their eyes. "It's all in the papers. You can contest it, but the assessment will happen regardless." He rode off before they could respond, leaving them standing in the yard with the document that could mean the end of everything. Cale read through it slowly, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at Ruth, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before: defeat. He's done it carefully, hit every technical requirement, dotted every legal line. Even with the northern expansion, he can argue it's too new to count, that it shows poor planning rather than development. Cale's voice was hollow. "He's gonna win." "No." Ruth took the papers from him, scanned them herself. "No, he's not. Because we're not going to let him." "Ruth, you don't understand how this works. Carson has money, influence, lawyers. What do we have?" "Each other. The truth. And every person in this town who's sick of watching him steal what isn't his." Ruth's mind was racing, putting pieces together. "The assessment is in 2 weeks. That gives us time." "Time for what?" "Time to show them what this ranch really is. Time to prove that you haven't just maintained this land. You've made it thrive despite active opposition." Ruth grabbed his arm. "Time to make them see that taking this from you would be theft, pure and simple." Cale stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "How?" "We invite them here. All of them. The assessor, yes, but also the town. We show them the northern expansion, the line shack, the thriving herd. We show them the books, the plans for spring, the careful management you've been doing for years. Ruth was pacing now, energy and determination driving out the cold fear. We make it impossible for them to justify seizure because the evidence of success will be right in front of their faces. You want to put on a show. I want to put on a demonstration of competence, of vision, of everything this ranch is and could be. Ruth stopped in front of him. Unless you'd rather just hand Carson the victory without a fight. Fire sparked in Cale's eyes, replacing the defeat. You know I won't do that. Then we fight. We fight smart, we fight hard, and we fight together. Ruth held out her hand. What do you say, partner? Cale looked at her offered hand, at the determination in her face, at the absolute refusal to surrender that radiated from her like heat. Then he took her hand and pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers in a gesture of unity that made Ruth's heart stutter. Together, he said, and it was a promise. They spent the next 3 days planning. Ruth rode into town despite the cold, seeking out Martha Yates. I need your help, she said without preamble. Cale's help, the ranch's help. Martha listened as Ruth laid out Carson's petition and their plan to fight it. When Ruth finished, Martha was quiet for a long moment. You're asking me to go against the richest, most powerful man in Dry Hollow. I'm asking you to stand up for what's right. Those aren't always the same thing, girl. But Martha's eyes were thoughtful. Still, I've never liked bullies, and Carson's the worst kind, the kind that uses law and money to justify cruelty. She nodded slowly. All right, I'll help, and I'll talk to others who might be willing. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could go very wrong for all of us. Martha gripped Ruth's hand, but it could also go very right, and sometimes that's worth the risk. Over the next week, a strange thing happened. People began arriving at the ranch, not in large groups, but in ones and twos. Tom Yates came with lumber for reinforcing the barn. A rancher from 10 miles south brought advice on winter cattle management. Even the blacksmith stopped by with horseshoes and quiet words of support. Each visitor was shown the operation, the thriving main herd, the northern expansion, the meticulous records Kyle kept. Each left with a clearer understanding that Carson's petition was motivated by greed, not legitimate concern. You're building an army, Kyle said one evening after the third such visit. I'm building a defense, Ruth corrected. These people already knew you were competent. They just needed to see that fighting for you was worth the risk of Carson's displeasure. And you think it is? Worth the risk? Ruth looked around the kitchen, at the home they'd built together in more than just physical terms. I know it is. The night before the assessment, Ruth found Kyle in the barn, staring at nothing. Having second thoughts? She asked. Wondering what happens if we lose. If all this effort was for nothing. Ruth sat beside him on the hay bale. Then we lose, and we figure out what comes next. But at least we'll lose knowing we fought with everything we had. You could leave. Start over somewhere Carson's reach doesn't extend. I could. Ruth didn't pretend to misunderstand. But I won't. I told you, I'm not running anymore. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. Cale turned to look at her, and in his eyes Ruth saw everything he wasn't saying. Gratitude and fear and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. I love you, he said quietly. I didn't mean to. Didn't plan for it. But somewhere between your arrival and now, between survival and partnership, it happened. And I needed you to know. In case tomorrow. Ruth kissed him. It was impulsive and probably foolish and absolutely necessary. His surprise lasted only a moment before he responded, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. The kiss was tentative at first, then deeper, carrying all the words neither of them had said, all the feelings they'd been dancing around for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ruth rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered. And tomorrow we're going to win. Because we have too much to lose not to. How can you be so sure? Because I've lost before. I know what it looks like, what it feels like. And this? She pulled back to look at him. This isn't loss. This is the beginning of something worth fighting for. They stayed in the barn until the stars came out, talking and planning and simply being together. And when they finally went inside, they went hand in hand, no longer just partners, but something more. Something that Carson's greed and the town's judgment couldn't touch. The assessor arrived at noon with Carson, Peters, and two men Ruth didn't recognize who had the look of lawyers about them. Behind them came what looked like half the town, Martha and Tom Yates, the blacksmith, several ranchers, and even a few people Ruth had never met, but who clearly knew Kael's story. Carson's expression darkened when he saw the crowd. This is an official assessment, not a town meeting. It's an assessment of community resources, Martha said firmly. We have a right to observe. The assessor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a bureaucrat's carefully neutral expression, looked between Carson and the gathered townspeople. The petition allows for community input. I see no reason to exclude observers. Carson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The assessor turned to Kael. Mr. Rourke, shall we begin? What followed was the most nerve-wracking 3 hours of Ruth's life. The assessor examined everything: buildings, fences, livestock, records. Kael walked him through the operation with quiet competence, explaining each decision, each improvement, each plan for expansion. Ruth provided the financial records, showing income and expenses, demonstrating profitability despite the challenges. Then they rode to the northern pasture, the entire group following like a strange parade. The line shack stood solid and proud, the cattle grazing peacefully in the valley. The assessor examined the new structure, checked the fence lines, counted heads. Carson tried to argue it was too new to count, that it showed poor planning. But Tom Yates spoke up. I sold them the lumber 3 weeks ago. They built that in under 2 weeks while still managing the main operation. That's not poor planning, that's remarkable efficiency. Others chimed in, offering testimony about Kael's management, his care for the land, his years of steady improvement. Even people Ruth didn't know spoke up, apparently tired of Carson's monopolistic behavior. Through it all, the assessor took notes, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, as the sun began to set, they returned to the main ranch. The assessor retreated to his wagon to compile his report, while everyone else waited in tense silence. Ruth stood beside Kael, their hands joined where no one could see, and prayed to forces she didn't quite believe in that this would be enough. The assessor emerged with his papers and gathered everyone together. Based on my examination of the Rourke Ranch, I find the following. He paused, and Ruth's heart nearly stopped. The property shows evidence of careful management, ongoing improvement, and expansion of operations. The owner has demonstrated both current profitability and future planning. The cattle are healthy, the building's well-maintained, and the recent northern expansion shows initiative and business acumen. Carson's face went purple. But the petition, the assessor continued calmly, appears to be based on outdated or inaccurate information. As of this assessment, I find no grounds to support seizure or forced sale. The land is being worked to appropriate potential, and ownership rights remain with Mr. Kael Rourke. The crowd erupted in cheers. Ruth felt her knees go weak with relief, and only Kael's arm around her waist kept her upright. Carson's expression was murderous. This isn't over, Rourke. I'll find another way. No, you won't. The voice came from an unexpected source, one of the lawyers Carson had brought. I've witnessed this entire proceeding, Mr. Carson. If you pursue this matter further, I'll be compelled to testify that your petition was frivolous and motivated by personal gain rather than legitimate concern. That could have legal ramifications for you. Carson stared at his own lawyer in betrayal, then at the gathered townspeople who were clearly united against him. For the first time since Ruth had met him, he looked uncertain. This town will regret this, he said finally, then turned and rode away, Peters trailing behind him. The moment he was gone, the gathering erupted in celebration. People crowded around Kael, offering congratulations and support. Martha hugged Ruth so hard she could barely breathe. You did it, girl. You actually did it. We did it, Ruth corrected. All of us. As the crowd eventually dispersed, promising to spread the word of the victory, Ruth and Kael found themselves alone in the yard, watching the last rays of sunset paint the sky. We won, Kael said, as if he couldn't quite believe it. We did. He pulled her close, and Ruth went willingly, resting her head against his chest and feeling the steady beat of his heart. This was home, she realized. Not the ranch, not the buildings or the land. This, being held by someone who loved her, who'd fought beside her, who'd trusted her enough to let her fight for him. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we live," Kyle said simply. "We keep building, keep improving, keep proving them wrong." He pulled back to look at her. Together. Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep joy rather than surface happiness. Together. That night, wrapped in each other's arms by the fireplace, they began planning their future, not just survival, but actual thriving. Spring calving, expanded herds, maybe even hiring hands to help. Building something that would last, that would grow, that would stand as proof that love and determination could overcome hate and greed. Outside, the first stars appeared, bright and cold and infinitely promising. And inside, two people who'd both been running from pain found themselves running towards something better. Together. Winter settled over the ranch with a silence that felt like peace rather than isolation. The weeks following their victory over Carson brought changes that rippled through both the ranch and their lives in ways neither Ruth nor Kyle had anticipated. The first change came in the form of workers. Two young men arrived from a neighboring county, brothers who'd heard about the stand against Carson and wanted to work for someone who fought back against bullies. Kyle hired them cautiously at first, testing their commitment through the brutal cold and endless labor of a frontier winter. They proved themselves quickly, competent, and loyal, and suddenly the ranch felt less like a two-person struggle and more like the thriving operation it was meant to be. With help to manage the daily operations, Ruth and Kyle found themselves with something they'd never had before: time. Time to sit by the fire in the evenings without falling asleep from exhaustion. Time to talk about futures that stretched beyond the next crisis. Time to simply exist together without the constant pressure of survival weighing on every moment. It was during one of these evenings, 2 months after the assessment, that Kyle finally brought up the locked room again. "I'm ready," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "To open it. To let her memory breathe, like you said." Ruth set down the mending she'd been working on. "Now? Before I lose my nerve." They climbed the stairs together, and Kyle pulled a key from his pocket, worn brass that looked like it had been carried for years. His hand shook slightly as he fitted it into the lock. The door opened with a creak of disused hinges, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the lamplight Kyle held up, illuminating a space that was both shrine and storage. A simple wooden bed frame, a chest of drawers, and boxes carefully stacked along one wall. But what caught Ruth's attention was the beauty in the details. Intricate beadwork draped over a chair, a dress with patterns that spoke of skill and patience, books in a language Ruth didn't recognize. "She made all of this," Kyle said, his voice thick. "The beadwork, the dress, even some of the furniture." She said idle hands forgot who they were. Ruth moved carefully through the room, touching nothing but observing everything. This was Kyle's mother, preserved in objects and memory. A woman who'd loved beautiful things but valued usefulness more. A woman who'd taught her son to build and endure and never forget where he came from. "She would have liked you," Kyle said suddenly. "My mother. She would have seen the strength in you, the refusal to break. She valued that above all else. I wish I could have known her." "In a way you do. Everything I am that's worth anything, that came from her." He set down the lamp and opened one of the boxes. Inside were more beadwork pieces, some finished and some not. She was working on these when she got sick, never got to finish them. An idea sparked in Ruth's mind, tentative but growing stronger. "What if we did?" Kale looked up sharply. "What?" "Finished her work. Not to replace her or pretend we could do it as well, but to honor it, to let these pieces become what she intended instead of staying frozen halfway." Ruth moved closer. "You said she believed in usefulness." "Nothing useful about leaving beauty unfinished." For a long moment, Kyle said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. She'd like that, the practicality of it. He pulled out a partially completed piece, what looked like it would become a belt or sash. "Would you help me? I remember some of what she taught me, but not all of it." "I'll learn with you," Ruth promised. They spent the next hour carefully sorting through the room, separating what could be finished from what should be preserved as it was. It was painful work, each object carrying weight and memory, but it was also healing. The room began to feel less like a tomb and more like a treasure waiting to be shared. "What will you do with it all?" Ruth asked as they prepared to leave. Cale looked around the room one last time. "Some of it I'll keep, personal things, things that matter, but the rest, the beadwork, the beautiful things she made. Maybe it's time to let them go out into the world. Let other people see what she could create." He paused. "Maybe donate some to the church for their charity auction." She would have liked that, helping people. Ruth thought of the community that had rallied to defend the ranch, of Martha Yates and Tom and all the others who'd stood with them. "She'd be proud of you for building bridges instead of walls." I'm learning from the best," Kyle said, and the way he looked at her made Ruth's heart skip. They closed the door but didn't lock it. Some doors, once open, didn't need to be sealed again. Spring came late that year, the snow refusing to surrender its hold until well into April. But when it finally broke, it broke gloriously. The land transforming almost overnight from white and barren to green and alive. The calving season began, and with it came the frantic pace of new life that required constant vigilance. Ruth had studied for this, reading every book on cattle management Cale owned and asking endless questions. But nothing prepared her for the reality of it. The wonder of watching a calf take its first shaky steps, the heartbreak of losing one despite their best efforts, the sheer exhaustion of days that started before dawn and ended long after dark. The brothers proved invaluable during this time, their youth and energy keeping the operation running when both Kyle and Ruth were stretched to their limits. But it was Ruth who surprised everyone, including herself, with her instinct for the work. She could read a cow in labor better than men who'd been ranching for years, knew when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. "You're a natural," Kyle said one morning after Ruth had successfully helped deliver twins. "A rare and risky birth that could have gone very wrong." "How did you know to—" "I didn't know. I just felt it." Ruth washed blood from her hands, exhausted but exhilarated. "Sometimes I think your mother's teaching me through you. All those things she knew about reading signs, trusting instinct. You carry that, and somehow it's rubbing off." By the time calving season ended, they'd increased the herd by 32 healthy calves. The northern pasture expansion had worked better than they dared hope, and the main herd was thriving. For the first time since buying the ranch, Kyle's ledgers showed more than just survival. They showed profit. Real, substantial profit that meant security and possibility. "We could expand again," Kyle said one evening, showing Ruth the numbers. "Hire more permanent hands? Maybe build a second line shack further east where the grazing's good, but the land's going unused." "We could," Ruth agreed. "Or we could take a breath, enjoy what we've built before reaching for more." Cale studied her. "You're not usually one for caution. I'm one for sustainability. We've been running full speed since the moment I arrived. Maybe it's time to make sure our foundation is solid before we build higher." Ruth closed the ledger. "Besides, there's something else we should discuss." Something in her tone made Kyle set down his pencil. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, but I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Kyle's expression went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, joy, fear, wonder, before settling into something Ruth couldn't quite name. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor, and there's no doctor closer than 3 days' ride." What Ruth had suspected for weeks, but had waited until she was certain before saying anything. "I'm about 3 months along, I think, which means the baby would come in late fall, probably October." Kale stood abruptly, began pacing. Ruth watched him, her own emotions a complicated tangle. She'd never planned for children, never particularly wanted them in her old life. But this, a child born from choice and love rather than obligation, felt different. Terrifying, yes, but also right in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "We should get married," Kyle said suddenly, stopping mid-pace. "I know it's not romantic, not the proposal you deserve, but for the child's sake—" "I don't need romance," Ruth interrupted, "and I don't need marriage for legitimacy's sake. If we marry, it should be because we want to build that kind of partnership, not because convention demands it. Don't you want that? Partnership in all things?" Ruth stood, moving to stand before him. "I want honesty. I want you to tell me what you're really feeling, not what you think you should feel. Kael's hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their roughness. I'm terrified. My mother died giving birth to my younger brother. He died too. I've never told you that. Never wanted to scare you with what this land takes from people. His voice cracked. And now you're carrying my child, and all I can think about is losing you both. Ruth's heart broke and mended simultaneously. You won't lose me. You can't promise that. Nobody can. No, Ruth agreed, but I can promise to fight. To do everything possible to survive this because I have too much to live for now. She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. We both do. Kael pulled her close, and Ruth felt the tremor in his arms, the fear he was trying so hard to control. She held him just as tightly, understanding that this vulnerability was trust of the deepest kind. Marry me, he said again, quieter this time. Not for convention or legitimacy, but because I want to stand before this community that's finally starting to accept us and claim you publicly. Because I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours in all the ways that matter. Ruth pulled back to look at him. That's a better proposal. Is that a yes? That's a yes. They married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that was small but significant. Martha Yates helped Ruth make a dress from fabric ordered specially from town. Simple but beautiful, cream-colored with delicate embroidery that Ruth worked on by firelight. Kael wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to the harvest dance, and braided a piece of his mother's beadwork into his hair in a way that honored her memory. The ceremony took place at the ranch, not in town. Kael had suggested the church, but Ruth insisted otherwise. This is our home. This is what we built together. Let's start our marriage here, where it matters most. Tom Yates officiated, his weathered voice carrying the words of commitment across the small gathering. The 2 hired hands stood witness, along with Martha and a handful of others from town who'd become unlikely allies. Even the blacksmith came, bringing horseshoes bent into circles as wedding gifts. When Kael kissed her, sealing their vows, Ruth felt something slot into place deep in her chest. This was wholeness. This was belonging. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not rescue or escape, but true partnership with someone who saw all of her and loved her anyway. The celebration was modest, a meal Ruth and Martha had prepared together, music from a fiddle, one of the hands played surprisingly well, and dancing as the sun set over the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Ruth danced with her husband under stars that seemed close enough to touch, and for the first time in her life, felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But happiness, Ruth learned, was not the same as ease. As her pregnancy progressed, the work became harder. The heat of summer was oppressive, and her changing body struggled with tasks that had been second nature weeks before. Kael hovered, worried and protective to the point of frustration. I'm pregnant, not dying, Ruth snapped one afternoon after he'd tried to stop her from carrying water to the garden. I know that, but you're carrying precious cargo and I won't risk. Risk is part of life, Kael. I can't spend the next 6 months wrapped in cotton. Ruth softened her tone. I know you're afraid, but you have to let me live, even if that means taking reasonable risks. It became a negotiation, finding the balance between Ruth's fierce independence and Kael's consuming fear. She agreed to let the hired hands take on heavier tasks. He agreed to stop treating her like she was made of glass. Together, they found a rhythm that worked, even if it wasn't always comfortable. The summer brought unexpected challenges beyond Ruth's pregnancy. A drought settled over the region, the creeks running low and the grass turning brown earlier than usual. Cattle prices dropped as everyone tried to sell stock they couldn't feed. The profit from spring calving evaporated into the cost of hauling water and supplementing feed. We're going to be all right, Kael said one night, staring at the ledgers that no longer looked as promising. We have reserves. We'll make it through. But Ruth could hear the worry beneath his words. They'd fought so hard to build security, and now weather and market forces threatened to undo it all. Then Martha Yates arrived with news that changed everything. Carson's leaving, she announced without preamble. Selling his holdings and moving east. Some kind of financial trouble, though he's keeping it quiet. Ruth and Kael exchanged glances. Selling to who? Kael asked. Bit of everything. The bank's being bought by a consortium from Denver. Most of his land parcels are going to various ranchers. Martha paused significantly. including a section that borders your northern pasture. The buyer wants to meet with you about potentially combining operations, sharing resources. It was opportunity disguised as neighborliness. The bordering section had better water access than their northern pasture, and combining resources could mean weathering the drought more easily. But it also meant trusting a stranger, opening their operation to outside influence. "Who's the buyer?" Ruth asked. "Name's Elizabeth Garrett, widow from back east who's investing in frontier land. Word is she's shrewd but fair." Martha smiled slightly. Apparently she heard about the woman who stood up to Carson and wanted to meet her. Ruth felt Cale's eyes on her. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think we meet with her. Hear what she has to say. We don't have to commit to anything, but closing doors without looking through them first is foolish." Elizabeth Garrett arrived the following week, and she was nothing like Ruth expected. Older, probably 50, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She dressed practically, rode her own horse, and got straight to business. "I've heard about your operation," she said as they showed her around. "Impressive, what you've built, especially given the opposition you've faced." "We've had help," Cale said carefully. "Help you earned by proving yourselves worth helping. That's rarer than you might think." Elizabeth examined the northern pasture with a professional eye. "My section has better water, but worse shelter. Yours has better shelter, but the creek's running low. Seems to me we could benefit each other." She proposed a partnership, shared water rights in exchange for shared grazing during drought conditions. No money changing hands, no formal merger, just neighbors helping each other survive. "Why?" Ruth asked bluntly. "What do you really get from this?" Elizabeth smiled approvingly. "Direct. I like that. What I get is assurance that my investment won't fail because my neighbors did. Ranching out here is hard enough without competing against each other when cooperation makes more sense." She paused. "Plus, I like supporting people who fight for what they've built. I did the same thing back east before my husband died. Started over out here because I wanted to prove I could." Ruth understood that motivation intimately. She looked at Kyle, saw her own thoughts reflected in his expression. This was trust, but it was also practical survival. They agreed to the partnership. The arrangement saved them both. Elizabeth's water kept their northern herd healthy through the worst of the drought. In return, Cale's expertise in frontier ranching helped Elizabeth avoid costly mistakes. It was cooperation instead of competition, and it worked. As autumn approached and Ruth's pregnancy entered its final months, she found herself thinking about legacy in new ways. The ranch was no longer just about survival or even success. It was about what they would pass on to their child, to the community, to the future. One evening in late September, as the air finally began to cool and hint at the winter to come, Kyle brought up expansion again. But this time it was different. "Not more land," he said. "Not more cattle. I want to build a school." Ruth looked up from the baby clothes she'd been sewing. "A school?" "For our child. For the workers' children when they start families. For any family within riding distance that wants education for their kids." Cale's expression was intense. "My mother believed education was freedom, that knowing how to read and write and figure gave you options that labor alone never could. I want that for our children, for all the children out here." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, hormones and emotion combining. "That's beautiful and ambitious. We could start small, one room, one teacher, use it as a community gathering space too for meetings and celebrations." He moved to sit beside her. "Your father built companies. I want to build community, real community, where people support each other instead of tearing each other down." "Then we build a school," Ruth said firmly. "After the baby comes and I'm back on my feet, we'll make it happen." The baby came on an October night during the first real cold snap of autumn. Ruth's labor started at sunset and progressed quickly, too quickly for them to get her to a doctor even if one had been close. Martha Yates came, bringing experience from birthing her own 6 children and helping with countless others. The pain was worse than anything Ruth had imagined, waves of it that left her gasping and certain she would die. She understood Kyle's fear now, understood why women fled this ranch when they realized how isolated they were, how far from help if something went wrong. But she also understood something else. She was stronger than the pain, stronger than the fear, and she was not alone. Cale stayed with her through it all, his hand crushed in hers, his voice steady even when she could see terror in his eyes. Martha guided them both, calm and capable, knowing exactly when to push and when to wait. And then, after hours that felt like years, a baby's cry split the air. "A girl," Martha announced, placing the squalling infant on Ruth's chest. "Perfect and healthy, and with a set of lungs that'll wake the dead." Ruth looked down at her daughter, red-faced and furious at being born, already fighting, and felt love so fierce it bordered on violence. This tiny creature was hers to protect, to teach, to raise in a world that wouldn't always be kind, but could be conquered through determination and love. "She's beautiful," Cale whispered, his voice thick with tears he didn't bother hiding. "She's perfect." They named her Sarah, after Cale's mother. Sarah Ruth Rourke, a name that honored the past while reaching toward the future. The days following Sarah's birth were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Ruth had never been so tired in her life, but she'd also never been so full of purpose. Every cry, every feeding, every small milestone felt momentous. Kyle was a revelation as a father, gentle and patient, singing Lakota lullabies his mother had taught him, telling Sarah stories about the land she would grow up learning to love. The community rallied in ways that surprised them both. Elizabeth Garrett brought a cradle her own children had used, beautifully carved and still sturdy. Martha organized a rotation of women from town to help with cooking and cleaning during Ruth's recovery. Even people who'd been uncertain about KL before came bearing gifts and congratulations, won over by the simple humanity of new life. Winter came early that year, snow falling in November and not stopping until March. But inside the ranch house, warmth prevailed. Sarah grew strong and healthy, hitting milestones that made Ruth simultaneously proud and wistful for how quickly time passed. Cale balanced ranch work with fatherhood with a grace Ruth admired, never complaining about sleepless nights or the constant demands of an infant. And slowly, carefully, they began planning the school. It started as conversations during Sarah's naps: where to build it, how to fund it, who might teach. Elizabeth Garrett offered land and financial support. Martha knew a young woman from back east with teaching credentials who was looking for frontier work. Tom Yates volunteered to help with construction. By the time spring returned, they had a plan. By summer, they had a foundation. And by the following autumn, when Sarah took her first tottering steps, they had a building, small but solid, with windows that let in light and a stove to keep out winter's cold. The school opened with 6 students, children of ranchers and workers, ages ranging from 5 to 12. Miss Catherine Reynolds, the young teacher Martha had found, proved to be exactly what they needed. Educated but practical, firm but kind, understanding that frontier children require different approaches than city ones. Ruth found herself involved in ways she hadn't expected, helping with lessons when she could, organizing books and supplies, watching Sarah play with other children her age. This was community building in its truest form, investing in the future, creating opportunities that hadn't existed before. The ranch thrived over the next few years. The drought broke, bringing rains that turned the land lush and productive. The herd grew steadily, managed carefully to maintain sustainability rather than pursuing maximum growth. The partnership with Elizabeth Garrett expanded into friendship. 2 strong women who understood each other's struggles and celebrated each other's victories. And the school became the heart of the community. It wasn't just a place for education, but for gatherings, celebrations, meetings where neighbors made decisions about shared resources and mutual support. The model they created, cooperation instead of competition, spread to other aspects of frontier life, slowly reshaping what was possible. Ruth watched it all with wonder, sometimes unable to believe this was her life. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 5 years ago had been running from pain and judgment. The woman she'd become had created something worth running toward. A home, a family, a community that valued strength and compassion in equal measure. One evening in early spring, with Sarah asleep upstairs and the ranch settling into nighttime quiet, Ruth and Kyle sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky. "Do you ever think about Boston?" Kyle asked quietly. "About what your life would have been if you'd stayed?" "Sometimes," Ruth admitted, "but only in the way you think about a book you've finished reading. Interesting, but not something you need to return to." "No regrets?" "Hundreds, but none about coming here." None about choosing this life with you. Ruth leaned into his shoulder. What about you? Do you regret placing that advertisement? Kael laughed softly. I regret the first 5 responses, but the 6th. He kissed her temple. The 6th changed everything. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and the wind rustling through the grass. Closer, the sound of Sarah stirring in her sleep, mumbling words only she understood. This was legacy, Ruth thought. Not just land or success or even survival, but love manifest in daily choices, in hard work done well, in community built carefully and tended with care. They had transformed a dying ranch into a thriving operation, a hostile town into genuine community, isolation into connection. And they had done it together. I love you, Ruth said, not for the first time, but always meaning it more than the time before. I love you too, Kael replied, for every yesterday that brought us here, for every today we build together, for every tomorrow still to come. Inside the house, Sarah called out in her sleep. Ruth stood to go to her daughter, but Kael caught her hand. I'll get her. You stay. Watch the stars. Remember where you've been and all the places you still want to go. He went inside and Ruth did as he suggested. She thought about the locked room that now stood open, filled with Sarah's toys alongside Kael's mother's treasures. She thought about the school building lights glowing warm in the distance. She thought about the northern pasture and the line shack they'd built when everyone said they would fail. Most of all, she thought about the 5 women who'd come before her and run. She hoped they'd found their own happiness, their own places to belong. But she also knew that this ranch, this life, had been waiting specifically for someone stubborn enough to stay, someone strong enough to fight, someone brave enough to build instead of flee. The woman who refused to run had found exactly what she'd been searching for. And in the morning, she would wake beside the man she loved, kiss the daughter she adored, and continue building the life they'd fought so hard to claim. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. Drought or disease, market crashes, or personal struggles. But none of it seemed insurmountable anymore. Not when faced together. From the house, she heard Kael singing Sarah back to sleep, a Lakota lullaby his mother had sung to him, the melody carrying across decades and lives to this moment. Ruth closed her eyes and listened, letting the music wash over her. This was home. This was love. This was legacy. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.
Just various crafting things, hatting mini. Oh, crochet and blocking. Hell yeah. That's awesome. I took a half day today. Oh, yes, right? Isn't that great? I love it when it can be a half day. That's nice. Just couldn't talk. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I couldn't talk either. That's why I canceled stream as well. Like, I was just like, there's no way. Like, my allergies were just insane. They were insanity. But yeah, I've been working on this top. I did a lot of progress yesterday. So this is what I mostly did yesterday. I did all of this. And then we started on the front today, and we're probably going to get that 46 rows done. And then essentially what's going to happen is these sides will come together at that point. But I think I'm going to make it a little bit longer, honestly, because I have, well, for one, because my chest size, and I think two, it probably would be, I would feel more comfortable if it's bigger armpit. Um, I was about to say armpit holes. That doesn't make any sense, does it? Armholes. It's been one of these days, I have to say. You could probably, actually, you can tell from my eyes. My eyes are a bit red shot. Way to go on the steps today, Mayor. Hope you're doing well. And 45 aluminum cans. Oh, hell yeah. Way to go on the collecting of cans, too. Thank you. Thank you, Kamei. I appreciate you. Yeah. Way to go completing the minis painting. Cranston. I tried during lessons and my kids were great and all and understanding, but I just couldn't do the full groups. Yeah, that's valid. That's so valid. But at least you tried. That's what matters. I was gonna try to work and I was like, you know what? Fuck it.